Section 29 of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. The works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1, by Edmund Burke. Section 29. Thoughts on the cause of the present discontents, Part 2. These singular advantages inspired His Majesty only with a more ardent desire to preserve unimpaired the spirit of that national freedom to which he owed a situation so full of glory. But to others it suggested sentiments of a very different nature. They thought they now beheld an opportunity, by a certain sort of statesman, never long undiscovered or unemployed, of drawing to themselves, by the aggrandizement of a court faction, a degree of power which they could never hope to derive from natural influence or from honourable service, and which it was impossible they could hold with the least security whilst the system of administration rested upon its former bottom. In order to facilitate the execution of their design, it was necessary to make many alterations in political arrangement, and a signal change in the opinions, habits, and connections of the greatest part of those who at that time acted in public. In the first place, they proceeded gradually, but not slowly, to destroy everything of strength which did not derive its principal nourishment from the immediate pleasure of the court. The greatest weight of popular opinion and party connection were then with the Duke of Newcastle and Mr. Pitt. Neither of these held their importance by the new tenure of the court. They were not therefore thought to be so proper as others for the services which were required by that tenure. It happened very favourably for the new system that under a forced coalition there rankled an incurable alienation and disgust between the parties which composed the administration. Mr. Pitt was first attacked. Not satisfied with removing him from power, they endeavoured by various artifices to ruin his character. The other party seemed rather pleased to get rid of so oppressive a support, not perceiving that their own fall was prepared by his, and involved in it. Many other reasons were prevented them from daring to look their true situation in the face. To the great Whig families it was extremely disagreeable, and seemed almost unnatural, to oppose the administration of a prince of the House of Brunswick. Day after day they hesitated and doubted and lingered, expecting that other councils would take place, and were slow to be persuaded that all which had been done by the cabal was the effect not of humour but of system. It was more strongly and evidently the interest of the new court faction to get rid of the great Whig connections than to destroy Mr. Pitt. The power of that gentleman was vast indeed and merited, but it was in a great degree personal and therefore transient. Theirs was rooted in the country. For, with a good deal less of popularity, they possessed a far more natural and fixed influence. Long possession of government, vast property, obligations of favours given and received, connection of office, ties of blood, of alliance, of friendship, things at that time supposed of some force, the name of Whig, dear to the majority of the people, the zeal early begun and steadily continued to the royal family. All these together formed a body of power in the nation, which was criminal and devoted. The great ruling principle of the cabal, and that which animated and harmonized all their proceedings, how various soever they may have been, was to signify to the world that the court would proceed upon its own proper forces only, and that the pretence of bringing any other into its service was an affront to it, and not a support. Therefore, when the chiefs were removed, in order to go to the root, the whole party was put under a prescription so general and severe as to take their hard-earned bread from the lowest officers in a manner which had never been known before, even in general revolutions. But it was thought necessary effectually to destroy all dependencies but one, and to show an example of the firmness and rigour with which the new system was to be supported. Thus for the time were pulled down, in the persons of the Whig leaders and of Mr. Pitt, in spite of the services of the one at the accession of the royal family and the recent services of the other in the war, the two only securities for the importance of the people, power arising from popularity and power arising from connection. Here and there, indeed, a few individuals were left standing, who gave security for their total estrangement from the odious principles of party connection and personal attachment, and it must be confessed that most of them have religiously kept their faith. Such a change could not, however, be made without a mighty shock to government. To reconcile the minds of the people to all these movements, principles correspondent to them had been preached up with great zeal. Everyone must remember that the cabal set out with the most astonishing prudery, both moral and political. Those who in a few months after soused overhead and ears into the deepest and dirtiest pits of corruption, cried out violently against the indirect practices in the electing and managing of parliaments, which had formerly prevailed. This marvellous abhorrence, which the court had suddenly taken to all influence, was not only circulated in conversation through the kingdom, but pompously announced to the public, with many other extraordinary things, in a pamphlet, which had all the appearance of a manifesto preparatory to some considerable enterprise. Throughout it was a satire, though in terms managed and decent enough, on the politics of the former reign. It was indeed written with no small art and address. In this piece appeared the first dawning of the new system. There first appeared the idea, then only in speculation, of separating the court from the administration, of carrying everything from national connection to personal regards, and of forming a regular party for that purpose, under the name of King's Men. To recommend this system to the people, a perspective view of the court, gorgeously painted and finely illuminated from within, was exhibited to the gaping multitude. Party was to be totally done away, with all its evil works. Corruption was to be cast down from court, as Ate was from heaven. Power was thenceforward to be the chosen residence of public spirit, and no one was to be supposed under any sinister influence, except those who had the misfortune to be in disgrace at court, which was to stand in lieu of all vices and all corruptions. A scheme of perfection to be realised in a monarchy far beyond the visionary republic of Plato. The whole scenery was exactly disposed to captivate those good souls, whose credulous morality is so invaluable a treasure to crafty politicians. Indeed, there was wherewithal to charm everybody, except those few who are not much pleased with professions of supernatural virtue, who know of what stuff such professions are made, for what purposes they are designed, and in what they are sure constantly to end. Many innocent gentlemen, who had been talking prose all their lives, without knowing anything of the matter, began at last to open their eyes upon their own merits, and to attribute their not having been Lords of the Treasury and Lords of Trade many years before, merely to the prevalence of party, and to the ministerial power, which had frustrated the good intentions of the court in favour of their abilities. Now was the time to unlock the sealed fountain of royal bounty, which had been infamously monopolised and huckstered, and to let it flow at large upon the whole people. The time was come to restore royalty to its original splendour. Maître le roi hors de page became a sort of watchword, and it was constantly in the mouths of all the runners of the court, that nothing could preserve the balance, of the Constitution from being overturned by the rabble, or by a faction of the nobility, but to free the sovereign effectually from that ministerial tyranny under which the royal dignity had been oppressed, in the person of His Majesty's grandfather. These were some of the many artifices used to reconcile the people to the great change which was made in the persons who composed the ministry, and the still greater which was made and avowed in its constitution. As to individuals, all the methods were employed with them, in order so thoroughly to disunite every party, and even every family, that no concert, order, or effect might appear in any future opposition. And in this manner an administration without connection with the people, or with one another, was first put in possession of government. What good consequences followed from it, we have all seen, whether with regard to virtue, public or private, to the ease and happiness of the sovereign, or to the real strength of government. But as so much stress was then laid on the necessity of this new project, it will not be amiss to take a view of the effects of this royal servitude and vile durance, which was so deplored in the reign of the late monarch, and was so carefully to be avoided in the reign of his successor. The effects were these. In times full of doubt and danger to his person and family, George II maintained the dignity of his crown, connected with the liberty of his people, not only unimpaired, but improved, for the space of 33 years. He overcame a dangerous rebellion, abetted by foreign force, and raging in the heart of his kingdoms, and thereby destroyed the seeds of all future rebellion that could arise upon the same principle. He carried the glory, the power, the commerce of England to a height unknown even to this renowned nation in the times of its greatest prosperity, and he left his succession resting on the true and only true foundations of all national and all regal greatness: affection at home, reputation abroad, trust in allies, terror in rival nations. The most ardent lover of his country cannot wish for Great Britain a happier fate than to continue as she was then left. A people, emulous as we are in affection to our present sovereign, know not how to form a prayer to heaven for a greater blessing upon his virtues, or a higher state of felicity and glory, than that he should live and should reign, and when Providence ordains it, should die, exactly like his illustrious predecessor. A great prince may be obliged, though such a thing cannot happen very often, to sacrifice his private inclination to his public interest. A wise prince will not think that such a restraint implies a condition of civility, and truly, if such was the condition of the last reign, and the effects were also such as we have described, we ought no less for the sake of the sovereign whom we love, than for our own, to hear arguments convincing indeed, before we depart from the maxims of that reign, or fly in the face of this great body of strong and recent experience. One of the principal topics which was then, and has been since, much employed by that political school, is an affected terror of the growth of an aristocratic power, prejudicial to the rights of the Crown and the balance of the Constitution. Any new powers exercised in the House of Lords, or in the House of Commons, or by the Crown, ought certainly to excite the vigilant and anxious jealousy of a free people. Even a new and unprecedented course of action in the whole legislature, without great and evident reason, may be a subject of just uneasiness. I will not affirm that there may not have lately appeared in the House of Lords a disposition to some attempts derogatory to the legal rights of the subject. If any such have really appeared, they have arisen, not from a power properly aristocratic, but from the same influence which is charged with having excited attempts of a similar nature in the House of Commons, which House, if it should have been betrayed into an unfortunate quarrel with its constituents, and involved in a charge of the very same nature, could have neither power nor inclination to repel such attempts in others. Those attempts in the House of Lords can no more be called aristocratic proceedings than the proceedings with regard to the county of Middlesex in the House of Commons can with any sense be called democratical. It is true that the peers have a great influence in the kingdom and in every part of the public concerns. While they are men of property, it is impossible to prevent it, except by such means as must prevent all property from its natural operation, an event not easily to be compassed. While property is power, nor by any means to be wished, while the least notion exists of the method by which the spirit of liberty acts, and of the means by which it is preserved. If any particular peers, by their uniform, upright, constitutional conduct, by their public and their private virtues, have acquired an influence in the country, the people, on whose favour that influence depends, and from whom it arose, will never be duped into an opinion that such greatness in a peer is the despotism of an aristocracy, when they know and feel it to be the effect and pledge of their own importance. I am no friend to aristocracy, in the sense at least in which that word is usually understood. If it were not a bad habit to moot cases on the supposed ruin of the constitution, I should be free to declare that if it must perish, I would rather by far see it resolved into any other form than lost in that austere and insolent domination. But, whatever my dislikes may be, my fears are not upon that quarter. The question on the influence of a court and of a peerage is not, which of the two dangers is the more eligible, but which is the more imminent. He is but a poor observer who has not seen that the generality of peers, far from supporting themselves in a state of independent greatness, are but too apt to fall into an oblivion of their proper dignity, and to run headlong into an abject servitude. Would to God it were true that the fault of our peers were too much spirit. It is worthy of some observation that these gentlemen, so jealous of aristocracy, make no complaints of the power of those peers, neither few nor inconsiderable, who are always in the train of a court, and whose whole weight must be considered as a portion of the settled influence of the crown. This is all safe and right, but if some peers, I am very sorry they are not as many as they ought to be, set themselves in the great concern of peers and commons against a backstairs influence and clandestine government, then the alarm begins, then the constitution is in danger of being forced into an aristocracy. I rest a little longer on this court topic because it was much insisted upon at the time of the great change, and has been since frequently revived by many of the agents of that party. For, whilst they are terrifying the great and opulent with the horrors of mob government, they are by other managers attempting, though hitherto with little success, to alarm the people with a phantom of tyranny in the nobles. All this is done upon their favourite principle of disunion, of sowing jealousies amongst the different orders of the state, and of disjointing the natural strength of the kingdom, that it may be rendered incapable of resisting the sinister designs of wicked men who have engrossed the royal power. Thus much of the topics chosen by the courtiers to recommend their system, it will be necessary to open a little more at large the nature of that party which was formed for its support. Without this, the whole would have been no better than a visionary amusement, like the scheme of Harrington's political club, and not a business in which the nation had a real concern. As a powerful party, and a party constructed on a new principle, it is a very inviting object of curiosity. It must be remembered that since the Revolution until the period we are speaking of, the influence of the Crown had been always employed in supporting the ministers of state and in carrying on the public business according to their opinions. But the party now in question is formed upon a very different idea. It is to intercept the favour, protection, and confidence of the Crown in the passage to its ministers. It is to come between them and their importance in Parliament. It is to separate them from all their natural and acquired dependencies. It is intended as the control, not the support, of administration. The machinery of this system is perplexed in its movements and false in its principle. It is formed on a supposition that the king is something external to his government, and that he may be honoured and aggrandised even by its debility and disgrace. The plan proceeds expressly on the idea of enfeebling the regular executory power. It proceeds on the idea of weakening the state in order to strengthen the court. The scheme depending entirely on distrust, on disconnection, on mutability by principle, on systematic weakness in every particular member, it is impossible that the total result should be substantial strength of any kind. As a foundation of their scheme, the cabal have established a sort of rota in the court. All sorts of parties by this means have been brought into administration, from whence few have had the good fortune to escape without disgrace, none at all without considerable losses. In the beginning of each arrangement, no professions of confidence and support are wanting, to induce the leading men to engage. But while the ministers of the day appear in all the pomp and pride of power, while they have all their canvas spread out to the wind, and every sail filled with the fair and prosperous gale of royal favour, in a short time they find, they know not how, a current which sets directly against them, which prevents all progress, and even drives them backwards. They grow ashamed and mortified in a situation which, by its vicinity to power, only serves to remind them the more strongly of their insignificance. They are obliged either to execute the orders of their inferiors, or to see themselves opposed by the natural instruments of their office. With the loss of their dignity, they lose their temper. In their turn, they grow troublesome to that cabal, which, whether it supports or opposes, equally disgraces and equally betrays them. It is soon found necessary to get rid of the heads of administration, but it is of the heads only, as there always are many rotten members belonging to the best connections. It is not hard to persuade several to continue in office without their leaders. By this means, the party goes out much thinner than it came in, and is only reduced in strength by its temporary possession of power. Besides, if by accident or in course of changes that power should be recovered, the junto have thrown up a retrenchment of these carcasses, which may serve to cover themselves in a day of danger. They conclude, not unwisely, that such rotten members will become the first objects of disgust and resentment to their ancient connections. They contrive to form in the outward administration two parties at the least, which, whilst they are tearing one another to pieces, are both competitors for the favour and protection of the cabal, and by their emulation contribute to throw everything more and more into the hands of the interior managers. A minister of state will sometimes keep himself totally estranged from all his colleagues, will differ from them in their counsels, will privately traverse and publicly oppose their measures. He will, however, continue in his employment. Instead of suffering any mark of displeasure, he will be distinguished by an unbounded profusion of court rewards and caresses, because he does what is expected and all that is expected from men in office. He helps to keep some form of administration in being, and keeps it at the same time as weak and divided as possible. However, we must take care not to be mistaken or to imagine that such persons have any weight in their opposition. When, by them, administration is convinced of its insignificancy, they are soon to be convinced of their own. They never are suffered to succeed in their opposition. They and the world are to be satisfied that neither office nor authority, nor property, nor ability, eloquence, counsel, skill, or union are of the least importance, but that the mere influence of the court, naked of all support and destitute of all management, is abundantly sufficient for all its own purposes. When any adverse connection is to be destroyed, the cabal seldom appear in the work themselves. They find out some person of whom the party entertains a high opinion. Such a person they endeavour to delude with various pretences. They teach him first to distrust, and then to quarrel with his friends, among whom, by the same arts, they excite a similar diffidence of him, so that in this mutual fear and distrust he may suffer himself to be employed as the instrument in the change which is brought about. Afterwards they are sure to destroy him in his turn, by setting up in his place some person in whom he had himself reposed the greatest confidence, and who serves to carry off a considerable part of his adherents. When such a person has broke in this manner with his connections, he is soon compelled to commit some flagrant act of iniquitous personal hostility against some of them, such as an attempt to strip a particular friend of his family estate, by which the cabal hope to render the parties utterly irreconcilable. In truth, they have so contrived matters that people have a greater hatred to the subordinate instruments than to the principal movers, as in destroying their enemies they make use of instruments not immediately belonging to their core. So in advancing their own friends, they pursue exactly the same method. To promote any of them to considerable rank or emolument, they commonly take care that the recommendation shall pass through the hands of the ostensible ministry. Such a recommendation might, however, appear to the world as some proof of the credit of ministers, and some means of increasing their strength. To prevent this, the persons so advanced are directed, in all companies, industriously to declare that they are under no obligations whatsoever to administration, that they have received their office from another quarter, that they are totally free and independent. When the faction has any job of lucre to obtain or of vengeance to perpetrate, their way is to select for the execution those very persons to whose habits, friendships, principles, and declarations such proceedings are publicly known to be the most adverse, at once to render the instruments the more odious, and therefore the more dependent, and to prevent the people from ever reposing a confidence in any appearance of private friendship or public principle. If the administration seem now and then, from remissness, or from fear of making themselves disagreeable, to suffer any popular excesses to go unpunished, the cabal immediately sets up some creature of theirs to raise a clamour against the ministers, as having shamefully betrayed the dignity of government. Then they compel the ministry to become active in conferring rewards and honours on the persons who have been the instruments of their disgrace, and, after having first vilified them with the higher orders for suffering the laws to sleep over the licentiousness of the populace, they drive them, in order to make amends for their former inactivity, to some act of atrocious violence, which renders them completely abhorred by the people. They who remember the riots which attended the Middlesex election, the opening of the present Parliament, and the transactions relative to St. George's Fields, will not be at a loss for an application of these remarks. That this body may be enabled to encompass all the ends of its institution, its members are scarcely ever to aim at the high and responsible offices of the state. They are distributed with art and judgment through all the secondary but efficient departments of office, and through the households of all the branches of the royal family, so as on one hand to occupy all the avenues to the throne, and on the other to forward or frustrate the execution of any measure, according to their own interests, for with the credit and support which they are known to have, though for the greater part in places which are only a genteel excuse for salary, they possess all the influence of the highest posts, and they dictate publicly in almost everything, even with a parade of superiority. Whenever they dissent, as it often happens, from their nominal leaders, the trained part of the Senate, instinctively in the secret, is sure to follow them, provided the leaders, sensible of their situation, do not of themselves recede in time from their most declared opinions. This latter is generally the case. It will not be conceivable to anyone who has not seen it, what pleasure is taken by the cabal in rendering these heads of office thoroughly contemptible and ridiculous, and when they are become so, they have then the best chance for being well supported. The members of the court faction are fully indemnified for not holding places on the slippery heights of the kingdom, not only by the lead in all affairs, but also by the perfect security in which they enjoy less conspicuous but very advantageous situations. Their places are in express legal tenure, or in effect all of them for life, whilst the first and most respectable persons in the kingdom are tossed about like tennis balls, the sport of a blind and insolent caprice. No minister dares even to cast an oblique glance at the lowest of their body. If an attempt be made upon one of this corps, immediately he flies to sanctuary, and pretends to the most inviolable of all promises. No conveniency of public arrangement is available to remove any one of them from the specific situation he holds, and the slightest attempt upon one of them by the most powerful minister is a certain preliminary to his own destruction. Conscious of their independence, they bear themselves with a lofty air to the exterior ministers. Like janissaries, they derive a kind of freedom from the very condition of their servitude. They may act just as they please, provided they are true to the great ruling principle of their institution. It is, therefore, not at all wonderful that people should be so desirous of adding themselves to that body in which they may possess and reconcile satisfactions the most alluring, and seemingly the most contradictory, enjoying at once all the spirited pleasure of independence, and all the gross lucre and fat emoluments of servitude. Here is a sketch, though a slight one, of the constitution, laws, and policy of this new court corporation. The name by which they choose to distinguish themselves is that of King's men or the King's friends, by an invidious exclusion of the rest of His Majesty's most loyal and affectionate subjects. The whole system, comprehending the exterior and interior administrations, is commonly called, in the technical language of the court, double cabinet, in French or English, as you choose to pronounce it. Whether all this be a vision of a distracted brain, or the invention of a malicious heart, or a real faction in the country, must be judged by the appearances which things have worn for 8 years past. Thus far I am certain that there is not a single public man, in or out of office, who has not, at some time or other, borne testimony to the truth of what I have now related. In particular, no persons have been more strong in their assertions, and louder and more indecent in their complaints, than those who compose all the exterior part of the present administration, in whose time that faction has arrived at such a height of power and of boldness in the use of it, as may, in the end, perhaps bring about its total destruction. It is true that about 4 years ago, during the administration of the Marquis of Rockingham, An attempt was made to carry on government without their concurrence. However, this was only a transient cloud. They were hid but for a moment, and their constellation blazed out with greater brightness, and a far more vigorous influence, some time after it was blown over. An attempt was at that time made, but without any idea of prescription, to break their core, to discountenance their doctrines, to revive connections of a different kind, to restore the principles and policy of the Whigs, to reanimate the cause of liberty by ministerial countenance. And then for the first time were men seen attached in office to every principle they had maintained in opposition. No one will doubt that such men were abhorred and violently opposed by the court faction, and that such a system could have but a short duration. It may appear somewhat affected that in so much discourse upon this extraordinary party I should say so little of the Earl of Bute, who is the supposed head of it, but this was neither owing to affectation nor inadvertence. I have carefully avoided the introduction of personal reflections of any kind. Much the greater part of the topics which have been used to blacken this nobleman are either unjust or frivolous. At best they have a tendency to give the resentment of this bitter calamity a wrong direction, and to turn a public grievance into a mean, personal, or dangerous national quarrel. Where there is a regular scheme of operations carried on, it is the system and not any individual person who acts in it that is truly dangerous. This system has not arisen solely from the ambition of Lord Bute, but from the circumstances which favoured it, and from an indifference to the constitution which had been for some time growing among our gentry. We should have been tried with it, if the Earl of Bute had never existed, and it will want neither a contriving head nor active members when the Earl of Bute exists no longer. It is not, therefore, to rail at Lord Bute, but firmly to embody against this court party and its practices, which can afford us any prospect of relief in our present condition. Another motive induces me to put the personal consideration of Lord Bute wholly out of the question. He communicates very little in a direct manner with the greater part of our men of business. This has never been his custom. It is enough for him that he surrounds them with his creatures. Several imagine, therefore, that they have a very good excuse for doing all the work of this faction, when they have no personal connection with Lord Bute. But whoever becomes a party to an administration composed of insulated individuals, without faith plighted, tie, or common principle, an administration constitutionally impotent, because supported by no party in the nation, he who contributes to destroy the connections of men and their trust in one another, or in any sort to throw the dependence of public councils upon private will and favour, possibly may have nothing to do with the Earl of Bute. It matters little whether he be the friend or the enemy of that particular person. But let him be who or what he will, he abets a faction that is driving hard to the ruin of his country. He is sapping the foundation of its liberty, disturbing the sources of its domestic tranquillity, weakening its government over its dependencies, degrading it from all its importance in the system of Europe. It is this unnatural infusion of a system of favouritism into a government which in a great part of its constitution is popular, that has raised the present ferment in the nation. The people, without entering deeply into its principles, could plainly perceive its effects in much violence, in a great spirit of innovation, and a general disorder in all the functions of government. I keep my eye solely on this system. If I speak of those measures which have arisen from it, it will be so far only as they illustrate the general scheme. This is the fountain of all those bitter waters of which through 100 different conduits, we have drunk until we are ready to burst. The discretionary power of the Crown in the formation of ministry, abused by bad or weak men, has given rise to a system which, without directly violating the letter of any law, operates against the spirit of the whole Constitution. End of section 29. Section 30 of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. The works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1, by Edmund Burke. Section 30. Of Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, Part 3. A plan of favouritism for our executory government is essentially at variance with the plan of our legislator. One great end, undoubtedly, of a mixed government like ours, composed of monarchy and of controls, on the part of the higher people and the lower, is that the prince shall not be able to violate the laws. This is useful indeed and fundamental. But this, even at first view, is no more than a negative advantage, an armour merely defensive. It is therefore next in order and equal in importance that the discretionary powers which are necessarily vested in the monarch, whether for the execution of the laws, or for the nomination to magistracy and office, or for conducting the affairs of peace and war, or for ordering the revenue, should all be exercised upon public principles and national grounds, and not on the likings or prejudices, the intrigues or policies of a court. This, I said, is equal in importance to the securing a government according to law. The laws reach but a very little way. Constitute government how you please, infinitely the greater part of it must depend upon the exercise of the powers, which are left at large to the prudence and uprightness of ministers of state. Even all the use and potency of the laws depends upon them. Without them, your commonwealth is no better than a scheme upon paper, and not a living, active, effective constitution. It is possible that through negligence or ignorance, or design artfully conducted, ministers may suffer one part of government to languish, another to be perverted from its purposes, and every valuable interest of the country to fall into ruin and decay, without possibility of fixing any single act on which a criminal prosecution can be justly grounded. The due arrangement of men in the active part of the state, far from being foreign to the purposes of a wise government, ought to be among its very first and dearest objects. When, therefore, the abettors of the new system tell us that between them and their opposers there is nothing but a struggle for power, and that therefore we are no ways concerned in it, we must tell those who have the impudence to insult us in this manner, that, of all things, we ought to be the most concerned who, and what sort of men they are that hold the trust of everything that is dear to us. Nothing can render this a point of indifference to the nation, but what must either render us totally desperate, or soothe us into the security of idiots. We must soften into a credulity below the milkiness of infancy to think all men virtuous. We must be tainted with a malignity truly diabolical to believe all the world to be equally wicked and corrupt. Men are in public life as in private, some good, some evil. The elevation of the one and the depression of the other are the first objects of all true policy. But that form of government which, neither in its direct institutions nor in their immediate tendency, has contrived to throw its affairs into the most trustworthy hands, but has left its whole executory system to be disposed of agreeably to the uncontrolled pleasure of any one man, however excellent or virtuous, is a plan of polity defective not only in that member, but consequently erroneous in every part of it. In arbitrary governments, the constitution of the ministry follows the constitution of the legislator. Both the law and the magistrate are the creatures of will. It must be so. Nothing indeed will appear more certain, on any tolerable consideration of this matter, than that every sort of government ought to have its administration correspondent to its legislator. If it should be otherwise, things must fall into a hideous disorder. The people of a free commonwealth, who have taken such care that their laws should be the result of general consent, cannot be so senseless as to suffer their executory system to be composed of persons on whom they have no dependence, and whom no proofs of the public love and confidence have recommended to those powers, upon the use of which the very being of the state depends. The popular election of magistrates and popular disposition of rewards and honours is one of the first advantages of a free state. Without it, or something equivalent to it, perhaps the people cannot long enjoy the substance of freedom, certainly none of the vivifying energy of good government. The frame of our commonwealth did not admit of such an actual election, but it provided as well, and, while the spirit of the constitution is preserved, better for all the effects of it than by the method of suffrage in any democratic state whatsoever. It had always, until of late, been held the first duty of Parliament to refuse to support government until power was in the hands of persons who were acceptable to the people, or while factions predominated in the court in which the nation had no confidence. Thus all the good effects of popular election were supposed to be secured to us, without the mischiefs attending on perpetual intrigue, and a distant canvass for every particular office throughout the body of the people. This was the most noble and refined part of our constitution. The people, by their representatives and grandees, were entrusted with a deliberative power in making laws, the king with the control of his negative. The king was entrusted with the deliberate choice and the election to office. The people had the negative in a parliamentary refusal to support. Formerly this power of control was what kept ministers in awe of parliaments, and parliaments in reverence with the people. If the use of this power of control on the system and persons of administration is gone, everything is lost, Parliament and all. We may assure ourselves that if Parliament will tamely see evil men take possession of all the strongholds of their country, and allow them time and means to fortify themselves, under the pretence of giving them a fair trial, and upon a hope of discovering whether they will not be reformed by power, and whether their measures will not be better than their morals, such a Parliament will give countenance to their measures also, whatever the Parliament may pretend, and whatever those measures may be. Every good political institution must have a preventative operation as well as a remedial. It ought to have a natural tendency to exclude bad men from government, and not to trust for the safety of the state to subsequent punishment alone. Punishment which has ever been tardy and uncertain, and which, when power is suffered in bad hands, may chance to fall rather on the injured than the criminal. Before men are put forward into the great trusts of the state, they ought by their conduct to have obtained such a degree of estimation in their country as may be some sort of pledge and security to the public, that they will not abuse those trusts. It is no mean security for a proper use of power that a man has shown by the general tenor of his actions, that the affection, the good opinion, the confidence of his fellow citizens have been among the principal objects of his life, and that he has owed none of the gradations of his power or fortune to a settled contempt, or occasional forfeiture of their esteem. That man who before he comes into power has no friends, or who coming into power is obliged to desert his friends, or who losing it has no friends to sympathise with him, he who has no sway among any part of the landed or commercial interest, but whose whole importance has begun with his office, and is sure to end with it, is a person who ought never to be suffered by a controlling Parliament to continue in any of those situations which confer the lead and direction of all our public affairs, because such a man has no connection with the interest of the people. Those knots or cabals of men who have got together, avowedly without any public principle, in order to sell their conjunct iniquity at the higher rate, and are therefore universally odious, ought never to be suffered to domineer in the state, because they have no connection with the sentiments and opinions of the people. These are considerations which, in my opinion, enforce the necessity of having some better reason in a free country and a free Parliament for supporting the ministers of the Crown, than that short one that the King has thought proper to appoint them. There is something very courtly in this, but it is a principle pregnant with all sorts of mischief, in a constitution like ours, to turn the views of active men from the country to the court. Whatever be the road to power, that is the road which will be trod. If the opinion of the country be of no use as a means of power or consideration, the qualities which usually procure that opinion will be no longer cultivated. And whether it will be right, in a state so popular in its constitution as ours, to leave ambition without popular motives, and to trust all to the operation of pure virtue in the minds of kings and ministers and public men, must be submitted to the judgment and good sense of the people of England. Cunning men are here apt to break in, and without directly controverting the principle, to raise objections from the difficulty under which the sovereign labours, to distinguish the genuine voice and sentiments of his people from the clamour of a faction by which it is so easily counterfeited. The nation, they say, is generally divided into parties, with views and passions utterly irreconcilable. If the king should put his affairs into the hands of any one of them, he is sure to discuss the rest. If he select particular men from among them all, it is a hazard that he discuss them all. Those who are left out, however divided before, will soon run into a body of opposition, which, being a collection of many discontents into one focus, will without doubt be hot and violent enough. Faction will make its cries resound through the nation, as if the whole were in an uproar, when by far the majority, and much the better part, will seem for a while as it were annihilated by the quiet in which their virtue and moderation incline them to enjoy the blessings of government. Besides that, the opinion of the mere vulgar is a miserable rule even with regard to themselves, on account of their violence and instability, so that if you were to gratify them in their humour to-day, that very gratification would be a ground of their dissatisfaction on the next. Now, as all these rules of public opinion are to be collected with great difficulty, and to be applied with equal uncertainty as to the effect, what better can a King of England do than to employ such men as he finds to have views and inclinations most conformable to his own, who are at least infected with pride and self-will, and who are least moved by such popular humours as are perpetually transversing his designs, and disturbing his service, trusting that, when he means no ill to his people, he will be supported in his appointments, whether he chooses to keep or to change, as his private judgment or his pleasure leads him. He will find a sure resource in the real weight and influence of the crown, when it is not suffered to become an instrument in the hands of a faction. I will not pretend to say that there is nothing at all in this mode of reasoning, because I will not assert that there is no difficulty in the art of government. Undoubtedly the very best administration must encounter a great deal of opposition, and the very worst will find more support than it deserves. Sufficient appearances will never be wanting to those who have a mind to deceive themselves. It is a fallacy in constant use with those who would level all things, and confound right with wrong, to insist upon the inconveniences which are attached to every choice, without taking into consideration the different weight and consequence of those inconveniences. The question is not concerning absolute discontent or perfect satisfaction in government, neither of which can be pure and unmixed at any time or upon any system. The controversy is about the degree of good humour in the people which may possibly be attained and ought certainly to be looked for. While some politicians may be waiting to know whether the sense of every individual be against them, accurately distinguishing the vulgar from the better sort, drawing lines between the enterprises of a faction and the efforts of a people, they may chance to see the government, which they are so nicely weighing and dividing and distinguishing, tumble to the ground in the midst of their wise deliberation. Prudent men, when so great an object as the security of government, or even its peace, is at stake, will not run the risk of a decision which may be fatal to it. They who can read the political sky will see a hurricane in a cloud no bigger than a hand at the very edge of the horizon, and will run into the first harbour. No lines can be laid down for civil or political wisdom. They are a matter incapable of exact definition. But, though no man can draw a stroke between the confines of day and night, yet light and darkness are upon the whole tolerably distinguishable. Nor will it be impossible for a prince to find out such a mode of government, and such persons to administer it, as will give a great degree of content to his people, without any curious and anxious research for that abstract, universal, perfect harmony, which while he is seeking, he abandons those means of ordinary tranquillity which are in his power without any research at all. It is not more the duty than it is the interest of a prince to aim at giving tranquillity to his government, but those who advise him may have an interest in disorder and confusion. If the opinion of the people is against them, they will naturally wish that it should have no prevalence. Here it is that the people must on their part show themselves sensible of their own value. Their whole importance in the first instance, and afterwards their whole freedom, is at stake. Their freedom cannot long survive their importance. Here it is that the natural strength of the kingdom, the great peers, the leading landed gentlemen, the opulent merchants and manufacturers, the substantial yeomanry, must interpose to rescue their prince, themselves, and their posterity. We are at present at issue upon this point. We are in the great crisis of this contention, and the part which men take one way or other will serve to discriminate their characters and their principles. Until the matter is decided, the country will remain in its present confusion. For while a system of administration is attempted, entirely repugnant to the genius of the people, and not conformable to the plan of their government, everything must necessarily be disordered for a time, until this system destroys the constitution, or the constitution gets the better of this system. There is, in my opinion, a peculiar venom and malignity in this political distemper beyond any that I have heard or read of. In former times, the projectors of arbitrary government attacked only the liberties of their country, a design surely mischievous enough to have satisfied a mind of the most unruly ambition. But a system unfavourable to freedom may be so formed, as considerably to exalt the grandeur of the state, and men may find in the pride and splendour of that prosperity some sort of consolation for the loss of their solid privileges. Indeed, the increase of the power of the state has often been urged by artful men as a pretext for some abridgment of the public liberty. But the scheme of the junto under consideration not only strikes a palsy into every nerve of our free constitution, but in the same degree benumbs and stupefies the whole executive power, rendering government in all its grand operations languid, uncertain, ineffective, making ministers fearful of attempting and incapable of executing any useful plan of domestic arrangement or of foreign politics. It tends to produce neither the security of a free government nor the energy of a monarchy that is absolute. Accordingly, the crown has dwindled away, in proportion to the unnatural and turgid growth of this excrescence on the court. The interior ministry are sensible that war is a situation which sets in its full light the value of the hearts of a people, and they well know that the beginning of the importance of the people must be the end of theirs. For this reason, they discover upon all occasions the utmost fear of everything, which by possibility may lead to such an event. I do not mean that they manifest any of that pious fear which is backward to commit the safety of the country to the dubious experiment of war. Such a fear, being the tender sensation of virtue, excited as it is regulated by reason, frequently shows itself in a seasonable boldness, which keeps danger at a distance by seeming to despise it. Their fear betrays to the first glance of the eye its true cause and its real object. Foreign powers, confident in the knowledge of their character, have not scrupled to violate the most solemn treaties, and, in defiance of them, to make conquests in the midst of a general peace, and in the heart of Europe. Such was the conquest of Corsica by the professed enemies of the freedom of mankind, in defiance of those who were formerly its professed defenders. We have had just claims upon the same powers, rights which ought to have been sacred to them as well as to us, as they had their origin in our lenity and generosity towards France and Spain in the day of their great humiliation. Such I call the ransom of Manila, and the demand on France for the East India prisoners. But these powers put a just confidence in their resource of the double cabinet. These demands, one of them at least, are hastening fast towards an acquittal by prescription. Oblivion begins to spread her cobwebs over all our spirited remonstrances. Some of the most valuable branches of our trade are also on the point of perishing from the same cause. I do not mean those branches which bear without the hand of the vine-dresser. I mean those which the policy of treaties has formerly secured to us. I mean to mark and distinguish the trade of Portugal, the loss of which and the power of the cabal have one and the same era. If by any chance the ministers who stand before the curtain possess or affect any spirit, it makes little or no impression. Foreign courts and ministers, who were among the first to discover and to profit by this invention of the double cabinet, attend very little to their remonstrances. They know that those shadows of ministers have nothing to do in the ultimate disposal of things. Jealousies and animosities are sedulously nourished in the outward administration, and have been even considered as a causa sine qua non in its constitution. Thence foreign courts have a certainty that nothing can be done by common counsel in this nation. If one of those ministers officially takes up a business with spirit, it serves only the better to signalise the meanness of the rest, and the discord of them all. His colleagues in office are in haste to shake him off, and to disclaim the whole of his proceedings. Of this nature was the astonishing transaction in which Lord Rochford, our ambassador at Paris, remonstrated against the attempt upon Corsica, in consequence of a direct authority from Lord Shelburne. This remonstrance the French minister treated with the contempt that was natural, as he was assured from the ambassador of his court to ours that these orders of Lord Shelburne were not supported by the rest of the, I had like to have said British, administration. Lord Rochford, a man of spirit, could not endure this situation. The consequences were, however, curious. He returns from Paris and comes home full of anger. Lord Shelburne, who gave the orders, is obliged to give up the seals. Lord Rochford, who obeyed these orders, receives them. He goes, however, into another department of the same office, that he might not be obliged officially to acquiesce in one situation under what he had officially remonstrated against in another. At Paris, the Duke of Choiseul considered this office arrangement as a compliment to him. Here it was spoken of as an attention to the delicacy of Lord Rochford, but whether the compliment was to one or both, to this nation it was the same. By this transaction, the condition of our court lay exposed in all its nakedness. Our office correspondence has lost all pretence to authenticity. British policy is brought into derision in those nations that a while ago trembled at the power of our arms, whilst they looked up with confidence to the equity, firmness, and candour which shone in all our negotiations. I represent this matter exactly in the light in which it has been universally received. Such has been the aspect of our foreign politics under the influence of a double cabinet. With such an arrangement at court, it is impossible it should have been otherwise. Nor is it possible that this scheme should have a better effect upon the government of our dependencies, the first, the dearest, and most delicate objects of the interior policy of this empire. The colonies know that administration is separated from the court, divided within itself and detested by the nation. The double cabinet has, in both the parts of it, shown the most malignant dispositions towards them, without being able to do them the smallest mischief. They are convinced by sufficient experience that no plan either of lenity or rigour can be pursued with uniformity and perseverance. Therefore they turn their eyes entirely from Great Britain, where they have neither dependence on friendship nor apprehension from enmity. They look to themselves and their own arrangements. They grow every day into alienation from this country, and whilst they are being disconnected with our government, we have not the consolation to find that they are even friendly in their new independence. Nothing can equal the futility, the weakness, the rashness, the timidity, the perpetual contradiction in the management of our affairs in that part of the world. A volume might be written on this melancholy subject, but it were better to leave it entirely to the reflections of the reader himself, than not to treat it in the extent it deserves. In what manner our domestic economy is affected by this system, it is needless to explain. It is the perpetual subject of their own complaints. The court party resolve the whole into faction, having said something before upon this subject. I shall only observe here, that when they give this account of the prevalence of faction, they present no very favourable aspect of the confidence of the people in their own government. They may be assured that however they amuse themselves with a variety of projects for substituting something else in the place of that great and only foundation of government, the confidence of the people, every attempt will but make their condition worse. When men imagine that their food is only a cover for poison, and when they neither love nor trust the hand that serves it, it is not the name of the roast beef of old England that will persuade them to sit down to the table that is spread for them. When the people conceive that laws and tribunals and even popular assemblies are perverted from the ends of their institution, they find in those names of degenerated establishments only new motives to discontent. Those bodies, which when full of life and beauty, lay in their arms and were their joy and comfort, when dead and putrid, become but the more loathsome from remembrance of former endearments. A sullen gloom and furious disorder prevail by fits. The nation loses its relish for peace and prosperity, as it did in that season of fulness which opened our troubles in the time of Charles I. A species of men to whom a state of order would become a sentence of obscurity are nourished into a dangerous magnitude by the heat of intestine disturbances, and it is no wonder that by a sort of sinister piety they cherish in their turn the disorders which are the parents of all their consequence. Superficial observers consider such persons as the cause of the public uneasiness, when, in truth, they are nothing more than the effect of it. Good men look upon this distracted scene with sorrow and indignation. Their hands are tied behind them. They are despoiled of all the power which might enable them to reconcile the strength of government with the rights of the people. They stand in a most distressing alternative. But in the election among evils, they hope better things from temporary confusion than from established servitude. In the meantime, the voice of law is not to be heard. Fierce licentiousness begets violent restraints. The military arm is the sole reliance. And then, call your constitution what you please, it is the sword that governs. The civil power, like every other that calls in the aid of an ally stronger than itself, perishes by the assistance it receives. But the contrivers of this scheme of government will not trust solely to the military power, because they are cunning men. Their restless and crooked spirit drives them to rake in the dirt of every kind of expedient. Unable to rule the multitude, they endeavour to raise divisions amongst them. One mob is hired to destroy another, a procedure which at once encourages the boldness of the populace, and justly increases their discontent. Men become pensioners of state on account of their abilities in the array of riot, and the discipline of confusion. Government is put under the disgraceful necessity of protecting from the severity of the laws that very licentiousness which the laws had been before violated to repress. Everything partakes of the original disorder. Anarchy predominates without freedom, and servitude without submission or subordination. These are the consequences inevitable to our public peace, from the scheme of rendering the executory government at once odious and feeble, of freeing administration from the constitutional and salutary control of Parliament, and inventing for it a new control, unknown to the Constitution, an interior cabinet which brings the whole body of government into confusion and contempt. After having stated, as shortly as I am able, the effects of this system on our foreign affairs, on the policy of our government with regard to our dependencies, and on the interior economy of the Commonwealth, there remains only in this part of my design to say something of the grand principle which first recommended this system at court. The pretence was to prevent the king from being enslaved by a faction and made a prisoner in his closet. This scheme might have been expected to answer at least its own end, and to indemnify the king in his personal capacity for all the confusion into which it has thrown this government. But has it in reality answered this purpose? I am sure if it had, every affectionate subject would have one motive for enduring with patience all the evils which attend it. In order to come at the truth in this matter, it may not be amiss to consider it somewhat in detail. I speak here of the king and not of the crown, the interests of which we have already touched. Independence of that greatness which a king possesses merely by being a representative of the national dignity. The things in which he may have an individual interest seem to be these: wealth accumulated, wealth spent in magnificence, pleasure or beneficence, personal respect and attention, and above all, private ease and repose of mind. These compose the inventory of prosperous circumstances, whether they regard a prince or a subject, their enjoyments differing only in the scale upon which they are formed. Suppose then we were to ask whether the king has been richer than his predecessors in accumulated wealth, since the establishment of the plan of favouritism. I believe it will be found that the picture of royal indignance, which our court has presented until this year, has been truly humiliating. Nor has it been relieved from this unseemly distress, but by means which have hazarded the affection of the people, and shaken their confidence in Parliament. If the public treasures had been exhausted in magnificence and splendour, this distress would have been accounted for, and in some measure justified. Nothing would be more unworthy of this nation than with a mean and mechanical rule to mete out the splendour of the crown. Indeed, I have found very few persons disposed to such ungenerous a procedure, but the generality of people, it must be confessed, do feel a good deal mortified when they compare the wants of the court with its expenses. They do not behold the cause of this distress in any part of the apparatus of royal magnificence. In all this they see nothing but the operations of parsimony, attended with all the consequences of profusion. Nothing expended, nothing saved. Their wonder is increased by their knowledge that besides the revenue settled on His Majesty's civil list, to the amount of £800,000 a year, he has a farther aid from a large pension list, near £90,000 a year. In Ireland, from the produce of the Duchy of Lancaster, which we are told has been greatly improved, from the revenue of the Duchy of Cornwall, from the American quit rents, from the 4.5% duty in the Leeward Islands, this last worth, to be sure, considerably more than £40,000 a year. The whole is certainly not much short of £1 million annually. There are revenues within the knowledge and cognizance of our national councils. We have no direct right to examine into the receipts from His Majesty's German dominions and the bishopric of Osnaburg. This is unquestionably true, but that which is not within the province of Parliament is yet within the sphere of every man's own reflection. If a foreign prince resided amongst us, the state of his revenues could not fail of becoming the subject of our speculation. Filled with an anxious concern for whatever regards the welfare of our sovereign, it is impossible, in considering the miserable circumstances into which he has been brought, that this obvious topic should be entirely passed over. There is an opinion universal that these revenues produce something not inconsiderable, clear of all charges and establishments. This produce the people do not believe to be hoarded, nor perceive to be spent. It is accounted for in the only manner it can, by supposing that it is drawn away for the support of the court faction, which, whilst it distresses the nation, impoverishes the prince in every one of his resources. I once more caution the reader that I do not urge this consideration concerning the foreign revenue, as if I supposed we had a direct right to examine into the expenditure of any part of it, but solely for the purpose of showing how little this system of favouritism has been advantageous to the monarch himself, which, without magnificence, has sunk him into a state of unnatural poverty, at the same time that he possessed every means of affluence from ample revenues, both in this country and in other parts of his dominions. Has this system provided better for the treatment becoming his high and sacred character, and secured the king from those disgusts attached to the necessity of employing men who are not personally agreeable? This is a topic upon which, for many reasons, I could wish to be silent, but the pretence of securing against such cause of uneasiness is the cornerstone of the court party. It has, however, so happened that if I were to fix upon any one point in which this system has been more particularly and shamefully blamable, the effects which it has produced would justify me in choosing for that point its tendency to degrade the personal dignity of the sovereign, and to expose him to 1,000 contradictions and mortifications. It is but too evident in what manner these projectors of royal greatness have fulfilled all their magnificent promises. Without recapitulating all the circumstances of the reign, every one of which is more or less a melancholy proof of the truth of what I have advanced, let us consider the language of the court but a few years ago, concerning most of the persons now in the external administration. Let me ask whether any enemy to the personal feelings of the sovereign could possibly contrive a keener instrument of mortification and degradation of all dignity than almost every part and member of the present arrangement. Nor in the whole course of our history has any compliance with the will of the people ever been known to extort from any prince a greater contradiction to all his own declared affections and dislikes than that which is now adopted, in direct opposition to everything the people approve and desire. An opinion prevails that greatness has been more than once advertised to submit to certain condescensions towards individuals, which have been denied to the entreaties of a nation. For the meanest and most dependent instrument of this system knows that there are hours when its existence may depend upon its adherence to it, and he takes his advantage accordingly. Indeed, it is a law of nature, that whoever is necessary to what we have made our object is sure, in some way, or in some time or other, to become our master. All this, however, is submitted to, in order to avoid that monstrous evil of governing in concurrence with the opinion of the people. For it seems to be laid down as a maxim, that a king has some sort of interest in giving uneasiness to his subjects, that all who are pleasing to them are to be of course disagreeable to him, that as soon as the persons who are odious at court are known to be odious to the people, it is snatched at as a lucky occasion of showering down upon them all kinds of emoluments and honours. None are considered as well-wishers to the crown, but those who advise to some unpopular course of action; none capable of serving it, but those who are obliged to call at every instant upon all its power for the safety of their lives. None are supposed to be fit priests in the temple of government, but the persons who are compelled to fly into it for sanctuary. Such is the effect of this refined project, such is ever the result of all the contrivances which are used to free men from the servitude of their reason, and from the necessity of ordering their affairs according to their evident interests. These contrivances oblige them to run into a real and ruinous servitude, in order to avoid a supposed restraint that might be attended with advantage. If, therefore, this system has so ill answered its own grand pretence of saving the king from the necessity of employing persons disagreeable to him, has it given more peace and tranquillity to his Majesty's private hours? No, most certainly. The father of his people cannot possibly enjoy repose while his family is in such a state of distraction. Then what has the crown or the king profited by all this fine wrought scheme? Is he more rich, or more splendid, or more powerful, or more at his ease, by so many labours and contrivances? Have they not beggared his exchequer, tarnished the splendour of his court, sunk his dignity, galled his feelings, discomposed the whole order and happiness of his private life? It will be very hard, I believe, to state in what respect the king has profited by that faction which presumptuously choose to call themselves his friends. End of section 30. Section 31 of the Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. The Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1, by Edmund Burke. Of the Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, Part 4. If particular men had grown into an attachment by the distinguished honour of the society of their sovereign, and by being the partakers of his amusements, came sometimes to prefer the gratification of his personal inclinations to the support of his high character, the thing would be very natural, and it would be excusable enough. But the pleasant part of the story is that these king's friends have no more ground for usurping such a title than a resident freeholder in Cumberland or in Cornwall. They are only known to their sovereign by kissing his hand, for the offices, pensions, and grants into which they have deceived his benignity. May no storm ever come which will put the firmness of their attachment to the proof, and which, in the midst of confusions and terrors and sufferings, may demonstrate the eternal difference between a true and severe friend to the monarchy and a slippery sycophant of the court. Quantum infido scurre distabit amicus. So far I have considered the effect of the court system, chiefly as it operates upon the executive government, on the temple of the people, and on the happiness of the sovereign. It remains that we should consider with a little attention its operation upon Parliament. Parliament was indeed the great object of all these politics, the end at which they aimed, as well as the instrument by which they were to operate. But before Parliament could be made subservient to a system by which it was to be degraded from the dignity of a national council into a mere member of the court, it must be greatly changed from its original character. In speaking of this body, I have my eye chiefly on the House of Commons. I hope I shall be indulged in a few observations on the nature and character of that assembly, not with regard to its legal form and power, but to its spirit and to the purposes it is meant to answer in the Constitution. The House of Commons was supposed originally to be no part of the standing government of this country. It was considered as a control issuing immediately from the people, and speedily to be resolved into the mass from whence it arose. In this respect it was in the higher part of government what juries are in the lower, the capacity of a magistrate being transitory, and that of a citizen permanent. The latter capacity, it was hoped, would of course preponderate in all discussions, not only between the people and the standing authority of the Crown, but between the people and the fleeting authority of the House of Commons itself. It was hoped that, being of a middle nature between subject and government, they would feel with a more tender and nearer interest everything that concerned the people, than the other remoter and more permanent parts of legislature. Whatever alterations time and the necessary accommodation of business may have introduced, this character can never be sustained, unless the House of Commons shall be made to bear some stamp of the actual disposition of the people at large. It would, among public misfortunes, be an evil more natural and tolerable, that the House of Commons should be infected with every epidemical frenzy of the people, as this would indicate some consanguinity, some sympathy of nature with their constituents, than that they should in all cases be wholly untouched by the opinions and feelings of the people out of doors. By this want of sympathy they would cease to be a House of Commons, for it is not the derivation of the power of that House from the people which makes it in a distinct sense their representative. The King is the representative of the people, so are the Lords, so are the Judges. They all are trustees for the people, as well as the Commons, because no power is given for the sole sake of the holder, and although government certainly is an institution of divine authority, yet its forms and the persons who administer it all originate from the people. A popular origin cannot therefore be the characteristical distinction of a popular representative. This belongs equally to all parts of government and in all forms. The virtue, spirit, and essence of a House of Commons consists in its being the express image of the feelings of the nation. It was not instituted to be a control upon the people, as of late it has been taught by a doctrine of the most pernicious tendency. It was designed as a control for the people. Other institutions have been formed for the purpose of checking popular excesses, and they are, I apprehend, fully adequate to their object. If not, they ought to be made so. The House of Commons, as it was never intended for the support of peace and subordination, is miserably appointed for that service, having no stronger weapon than its mace, and no better officer than its sergeant-at-arms, which it can command of its own proper authority, a vigilant and jealous eye over executory and judicial magistracy, an anxious care of public money, an openness, approaching towards facility, to public complaint. These seem to be the true characteristics of a House of Commons. But an addressing House of Commons and a petitioning nation, a House of Commons full of confidence, when the nation is plunged in despair, in the utmost harmony with ministers, whom the people regard with the utmost abhorrence, who vote thanks when the public opinion calls upon them for impeachments, who are eager to grant when the general voice demands account, who in all disputes between the people and administration presume against the people, who punish their disorders, but refuse even to inquire into the provocations to them. This is an unnatural, a monstrous state of things in this constitution. Such an assembly may be a great, wise, awful senate, but it is not to any popular purpose a House of Commons. This change from an immediate state of procuration and delegation to a course of acting as from original power is the way in which all the popular magistracies in the world have been perverted from their purposes. It is indeed their greatest and sometimes their incurable corruption, for there is a material distinction between that corruption by which particular points are carried against reason. This is a thing which cannot be prevented by human wisdom, and is of loss consequence, and the corruption of the principle itself, for then the evil is not accidental but settled. The distemper becomes the natural habit. For my part, I shall be compelled to conclude the principle of Parliament to be totally corrupted, and therefore it ends entirely defeated, when I see two symptoms. First, a rule of indiscriminate support to all ministers, because this destroys the very end of Parliament as a control, and is a general, previous sanction to misgovernment. And secondly, the setting up any claims adverse to the right of free election, for this tends to subvert the legal authority by which the House of Commons sits. I know that since the Revolution, along with many dangerous, many useful powers of government have been weakened, it is absolutely necessary to have frequent recourse to the legislator. Parliaments must therefore sit every year and for great part of the year. The dreadful disorders of frequent elections have also necessitated a septennial instead of a triennial duration. These circumstances, I mean the constant habit of authority and the unfrequency of elections, have tended very much to draw the House of Commons towards the character of a standing Senate. It is a disorder which has arisen from the cure of greater disorders. It has arisen from the extreme difficulty of reconciling liberty under a monarchical government with external strength and with internal tranquillity. It is very clear that we cannot free ourselves entirely from this great inconvenience, but I would not increase an evil, because I was not able to remove it, and because it was not in my power to keep the House of Commons religiously true to its first principles. I would not argue for carrying it to a total oblivion of them. This has been the great scheme of power in our time. They, who will not conform their conduct to the public good, and cannot support it by the prerogative of the Crown, have adopted a new plan. They have totally abandoned the shattered and old-fashioned fortress of prerogative, and made a lodgment in the stronghold of Parliament itself. If they have any evil design, to which there is no ordinary legal power commensurate, they bring it into Parliament. In Parliament the whole is executed from the beginning to the end. In Parliament the power of obtaining their object is absolute, and the safety in the preceding prefect, no rules to confine, no after reckonings to terrify. Parliament cannot, with any great propriety, punish others for things in which they themselves have been accomplices. Thus the control of Parliament upon the executory power is lost, because Parliament is made to partake in every considerable act of government. Impeachment, that great guardian of the purity of the Constitution, is in danger of being lost, even to the idea of it. By this plan several important ends are answered to the cabal. If the authority of Parliament supports itself, the credit of every act of government which they contrive is saved. But if the act be so very odious that the whole strength of Parliament is insufficient to recommend it, then Parliament is itself discredited, and this discredit increases more and more that indifference to the Constitution, which it is the constant aim of its enemies, by their abuse of parliamentary powers, to render general among the people. Whenever Parliament is persuaded to assume the offices of executive government, it will lose all the confidence, love, and veneration which it has ever enjoyed whilst it was supposed the corrective and control of the acting powers of the state. This would be the event, though its conduct in such a perversion of its functions should be tolerably just and moderate. But if it should be iniquitous, violent, full of passion, and full of faction, it would be considered as the most intolerable of all the modes of tyranny. For a considerable time, this separation of the representatives from their constituents went on with a silent progress, and had those who conducted the plan for their total separation been persons of temper and abilities any way equal to the magnitude of their design, the success would have been infallible. But by their precipitancy they have laid it open in all its nakedness. The nation is alarmed at it, and the event may not be pleasant to the contrivers of the scheme. In the last session, the corps called the King's Friends made a hardy attempt all at once to alter the right of election itself, to put it into the power of the House of Commons to disable any person disagreeable to them from sitting in Parliament, without any other rule than their own pleasure, to make incapacities either general for descriptions of men or particular for individuals, and to take into their body persons who avowedly had never been chosen by the majority of legal electors, nor agreeably to any known rule of law. The arguments upon which this claim was founded and combated are not my business here. Never has a subject been more amply and more learnedly handled, nor upon one side, in my opinion, more satisfactorily. They who are not convinced by what is already written would not receive conviction, though one arose from the dead. I too have thought on this subject, but my purpose here is only to consider it as a part of the favourite project of government, to observe on the motives which led to it, and to trace its political consequences. A violent rage for the punishment of Mr. Wilkes was the pretence of the whole. This gentleman, by setting himself strongly in opposition to the court cabal, had become at once an object of their persecution and of the popular favour. The hatred of the court party pursuing, and the countenance of the people protecting him, it very soon became not at all a question on the man, but a trial of strength between the two parties. The advantage of the victory in this particular contest was the present, but not the only, nor by any means the principal object. Its operation upon the character of the House of Commons was the great point of view. The point to be gained by the cabal was this, that a precedent should be established tending to show that the favour of the people was not so sure a road as the favour of the court even to popular honours and popular trusts. A strenuous resistance to every appearance of lawless power, a spirit of independence carried to some degree of enthusiasm, an inquisitive character to discover, and a bold one to display, every corruption and every error of government. These are the qualities which recommend a man to a seat in the House of Commons, in open and merely popular elections. An indolent and submissive disposition, a disposition to think charitably of all the actions of men in power, and to live in a mutual intercourse of favours with them, an inclination rather to countenance a strong use of authority, than to bear any sort of licentiousness on the part of the people. These are unfavourable qualities in an open election for members of Parliament. The instinct which carries the people towards the choice of the former is justified by reason, because a man of such character, even in its exorbitancies, does not directly contradict the purpose of a trust, the end of which is a control on power. The latter character, even when it is not in its extreme, will execute this trust but very imperfectly, and if deviating to the least excess, will certainly frustrate instead of forwarding the purposes of a control on government. But when the House of Commons was to be new modelled, this principle was not only to be changed but reversed. Whilst any errors committed in support of power were left to the law, with every advantage of favourable construction, of mitigation, and finally of pardon, all excesses on the side of liberty, or in pursuit of popular favour, or in defence of popular rights and privileges, were not only to be punished by the rigour of the known law, but by a discretionary proceeding, which brought on the loss of the popular object itself. Popularity was to be rendered, if not directly penal, at least highly dangerous. The favour of the people might lead even to a disqualification of representing them. Their odium might become, strained through the medium of 2 or 3 constructions, the means of sitting as the trustee of all that was dear to them. This is punishing the offence in the offending part. Until this time, the opinion of the people through the power of an assembly, still in some sort popular, led to the greatest honours and emoluments in the gift of the crown. Now the principle is reversed, and the favour of the court is the only sure way of obtaining and holding these honours, which ought to be in the disposal of the people. It signifies very little how this matter may be quibbled away. Example, the only argument of effect in civil life, demonstrates the truth of my proposition. Nothing can alter my opinion concerning the pernicious tendency of this example, until I see some man for his indiscretion in the support of power, for his violent and intemperate servility, rendered incapable of sitting in Parliament. For as it now stands, the fault of overstraining popular qualities, and irregularly, if you please, asserting popular privileges, has led to disqualification. The opposite fault never has produced the slightest punishment. Resistance to power has shut the door of the House of Commons to one man, obsequiousness and civility to none. Not that I would encourage popular disorder or any disorder, but I would leave such offences to the law, to be punished in measure and proportion. The laws of this country are for the most part constituted, and wisely so, for the general ends of government, rather than for the preservation of our particular liberties. Whatever therefore is done in support of liberty, by persons not in public trust, or not acting merely in that trust, is liable to be more or less out of the ordinary course of the law. And the law itself is sufficient to animadvert upon it with great severity. Nothing indeed can hinder that severe letter from crushing us, except the temperaments it may receive from a trial by jury. But if the habit prevails of going beyond the law, and superseding this judicator, of carrying offences, real or supposed, into the legislative bodies, who shall establish themselves into courts of criminal equity, so the Star Chamber has been called by Lord Bacon, all the evils of the Star Chamber are revived. A large and liberal construction in ascertaining offences, and a discretionary power in punishing them, is the idea of criminal equity. which is in truth a monster in jurisprudence. It signifies nothing whether a court for this purpose be a committee of council, or a House of Commons, or a House of Lords. The liberty of the subject will be equally subverted by it. The true end and the purpose of that House of Parliament, which entertains such a jurisdiction, will be destroyed by it. I will not believe what no other man living believes, that Mr. Wilkes was punished for the indecency of his publications, or the impiety of his ransacked closet. If he had fallen in a common slaughter of libellers and blasphemers, I could well believe that nothing more was meant than was pretended. But when I see that for years together, full as impious, and perhaps more dangerous writings to religion, and virtue and order have not been punished, nor their authors discountenanced, that the most audacious libels on royal majesty have passed without notice, that the most treasonable invectives against the laws, liberties, and constitution of the country have not met with the slightest animadversion, I must consider this as a shocking and shameless pretence. Never did an envenomed scurrility against everything sacred and civil, public and private, rage through the kingdom with such a furious and unbridled licence. All this while the peace of the nation must be shaken, to ruin one libeller, and to tear from the populace a single favourite. Nor is it that vice merely skulks in an obscure and contemptible impunity. Does not the public behold with indignation persons not only generally scandalous in their lives, but the identical persons who by their society, their instruction, their example, their encouragement, have drawn this man into the very faults which have furnished the cabal with a pretence for his persecution, loaded with every kind of favour, honour, and distinction which a court can bestow? Add but the crime of servility, the foedum crimen servitutis, to every other crime, and the whole mass is immediately transmuted into virtue, and becomes the just subject of reward and honour. When therefore I reflect upon this method pursued by the cabal in distributing rewards and punishments, I must conclude that Mr. Wilkes is the object of persecution, not on account of what he has done in common with others who are the objects of reward, but for that in which he differs from many of them, that he is pursued for the spirited dispositions which are blended with his vices, for his unconquerable firmness, for his resolute, indefatigable, strenuous resistance against oppression. In this case, therefore, it was not the man that was to be punished, nor his faults that were to be discountenanced. Opposition to acts of power was to be marked by a kind of civil proscription. The popularity which should arise from such an opposition was to be shown unable to protect it. The qualities by which court is made to the people were to render every fault inexpiable, and every error irretrievable. The qualities by which court is made to power were to cover and to sanctify everything. He that will have a sure and honourable seat in the House of Commons must take care how he adventures to cultivate popular qualities. Otherwise he may remember the old maxim, breves et infaustos populi Romani amores. If therefore a pursuit of popularity expose a man to greater dangers than a disposition to civility, the principle which is the life and soul of popular elections will perish out of the constitution. It behoves the people of England to consider how the House of Commons, under the operation of these examples, must of necessity be constituted. On the side of the court will be all honours, offices, emoluments, every sort of personal gratification to avarice or vanity, and what is of more moment to most gentlemen, the means of growing, by innumerable petty services to individuals, into a spreading interest in their country. On the other hand, let us suppose a person unconnected with the court, and in opposition to its system, for his own person, no office or emolument or title, no promotion ecclesiastical or civil or military or naval, for children or brothers or kindred. In vain an expiring interest in a borough calls for offices, or small livings for the children of mayors and aldermen and capital burgesses. His court rival has them all. He can do an infinite number of acts of generosity and kindness, and even of public spirit. He can procure indemnity from quarters. He can procure advantages in trade. He can get pardons for offences. He can obtain 1,000 favours and avert 1,000 evils. He may, while he betrays every valuable interest of the kingdom, be a benefactor, a patron, a father, a guardian angel to his borough. The unfortunate independent member has nothing to offer but harsh refusal, or pitiful excuse, or despondent representation of a hopeless interest, except from his private fortune, in which he may be equalled, perhaps exceeded, by his court competitor. He has no way of showing any one good quality, or of making a single friend. In the House he votes forever in a dispirited minority. If he speaks, the doors are locked. A body of loquacious placemen go out to tell the world that all he aims at is to get into office. If he has not the talent of elocution, which is the case of many as wise and knowing men as any in the House, he is liable to all these inconveniences, without the éclat which attends upon any tolerably successful exertion of eloquence. Can we conceive a more discouraging post of duty than this? Strip it of the poor reward of popularity. Suffer even the excesses committed in defence of the popular interest to become a ground for the majority of that House to form a disqualification out of the line of the law, and at their pleasure, attended not only with the loss of the franchise, but with every kind of personal disgrace. If this still happen, the people of this kingdom may be assured that they cannot be firmly or faithfully served by any man. It is out of the nature of men and things that they should, and their presumption will be equal to their folly if they expect it. The power of the people within the laws must show itself sufficient to protect every representative in the animated performance of his duty, or that duty cannot be performed. The House of Commons can never be a control on other parts of government, unless they are controlled themselves by their constituents, and unless those constituents possess some right in the choice of that House, which it is not in the power of that House to take away. If they suffer this power of arbitrary incapacitation to stand, they have utterly perverted every other power of the House of Commons. The late proceeding, I will not say, is contrary to law. It must be so, for the power which is claimed cannot, by any possibility, be a legal power in any limited member of government. The power which they claim of declaring incapacities would not be above the just claims of a final judicator, if they had not laid it down as a leading principle that they had no rule in the exercise of this claim, but their own discretion. Not one of their abettors has ever undertaken to assign the principle of unfitness, the species or degree of delinquency on which the House of Commons will expel, nor the mode of proceeding upon it, nor the evidence upon which it is established. The direct consequence of which is, that the first franchise of an Englishman, and that on which all the rest vitally depend, is to be forfeited for some offence which no man knows, and which is to be proved by no known rule whatsoever of legal evidence. This is so anomalous to our whole constitution, that I will venture to say the most trivial right which the subject claims never was, nor can be, forfeited in such a manner. The whole of their usurpation is established upon this method of arguing. We do not make laws. No, we do not contend for this power. We only declare law. And as we are a tribunal both competent and supreme, what we declare to be law becomes law, although it should not have been so before. Thus the circumstance of having no appeal from their jurisdiction is made to imply that they have no rule in the exercise of it. The judgment does not derive its validity from its conformity to the law, but, preposterously, the law is made to attend on the judgment, and the rule of the judgment is no other than the occasional will of the House. An arbitrary discretion leads, legality follows, which is just the very nature and description of a legislative act. This claim in their hands was no barren theory. It was pursued into its utmost consequences, and a dangerous principle has begot a correspondent practice. A systematic spirit has been shown upon both sides. The electors of Middlesex chose a person whom the House of Commons had voted incapable, and the House of Commons had taken in a member whom the electors of Middlesex had not chosen. By a construction on the legislative power which had been assumed, they declared that the true legal sense of the country was contained in the minority on that occasion, and might, on a resistance to a vote of incapacity, be contained in any minority. When any construction of law goes against the spirit of the privilege it was meant to support, it is a vicious construction. It is material to us to be represented really and bona fide, and not in forms, in types and shadows and fictions of law. The right of election was not established merely as a matter of form, to satisfy some method and rule of technical reasoning. It was not a principle which might substitute a Titius or a Movius, a John Doe or Richard Roe, in the place of a man specially chosen. Not a principle which was just as well satisfied with one man as with another. It is a right, the effect of which is to give to the people that man, and that man only, whom by their voices actually, not constructively given, they declare that they know, esteem, love, and trust. This right is a matter within their own power of judging and feeling, not an ens rationis, and creature of law. Nor can those devices by which anything else is substituted in the place of such an actual choice answer in the least degree the end of representation. I know that the courts of law have made as strained constructions in other cases. Such is the construction in common recoveries. The method of construction which in that case gives to the persons in remainder, for their security and representative, the doorkeeper, crier, or sweeper of the court, or some other shadowy being without substance or effect, is a fiction of a very coarse texture. This was, however, suffered by the acquiescence of the whole kingdom for ages, because the evasion of the old statute of Westminster, which authorised perpetuities, had more sense and utility than the law which was evaded. But an attempt to turn the right of election into such a farce and mockery as a fictitious fine and recovery will, I hope, have another fate, because the laws which give it are infinitely dear to us, and the evasion is infinitely contemptible. The people indeed have been told that this power of discretionary disqualification is vested in hands that they may trust, and who will be sure not to abuse it to their prejudice. Until I find something in this argument differing from that on which every mode of despotism has been defended, I shall not be inclined to pay it any great compliment. The people are satisfied to trust themselves with the exercise of their own privileges, and do not desire this kind intervention of the House of Commons to free them from the burden. They are certainly in the right. They ought not to trust the House of Commons with a power over their franchises, because the Constitution, which placed two other coordinate powers to control it, reposed no such confidence in that body. It were a folly well deserving servitude for its punishment, to be full of confidence where the laws are full of distrust, and to give to a House of Commons, arrogating to its sole resolution the most harsh and odious part of legislative authority, that degree of submission which is due only to the legislator itself. End of section 31. Section 32 of the Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. The Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1, by Edmund Burke. Of Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, Part 5. When the House of Commons, in an endeavour to obtain new advantages at the expense of the other orders of the state, for the benefit of the Commons at large, had pursued strong measures, if it were not just, it was at least natural, that the constituents should connive at all their proceedings, because we were ourselves ultimately to profit. But when this submission is urged to us in a contest between the representatives and ourselves, and where nothing can be put into their scale which is not taken from ours, they fancy us to be children when they tell us that they are our representatives, our own flesh and blood, and that all the stripes they give us are for our good. The very desire of that body to have such a trust contrary to law reposed in them shows that they are not worthy of it. They certainly will abuse it, because all men possessed of an uncontrolled discretionary power, leading to the aggrandizement and profit of their own body, have always abused it. And I see no particular sanctity in our times that it is at all likely by a miraculous operation to overrule the course of nature. But we must purposely shut our eyes, if we consider this matter merely as a contest between the House of Commons and the electors. The true contest is between the electors of the kingdom and the Crown. The Crown acting by an instrumental House of Commons. It is precisely the same, whether the ministers of the Crown can disqualify by a dependent House of Commons, or by a dependent Court of Star Chamber, or by a dependent Court of King's Bench. If once members of Parliament can be practically convinced that they do not depend on the affection or opinion of the people for their political being, they will give themselves over, without even an appearance of reserve, to the influence of the court. Indeed, a Parliament unconnected with the people is essential to a ministry unconnected with the people, and therefore those who saw through what mighty difficulties the interior ministry waded, and the exterior were dragged, in this business, will conceive of what prodigious importance the new corps of King's men held this principle of occasional and personal incapacitation to the whole body of their design. When the House of Commons was thus made to consider itself as the master of its constituents, there wanted but one thing to secure that House against all possible future deviation towards popularity: an unlimited fund of money, to be laid out according to the pleasure of the court. To complete the scheme of bringing our court to a resemblance to the neighbouring monarchies, it was necessary, in effect, to destroy those appropriations of revenue which seemed to limit the property, as the other laws had done the powers, of the Crown. An opportunity for this purpose was taken upon an application to Parliament for payment of the debts of the civil list, which in 1769 had amounted to £513,000. Such application had been made upon former occasions, but to do it in the former manner would by no means answer the present purpose. Whenever the Crown had come to the Commons to desire a supply for the discharging of debts due on the civil list, it was always asked and granted with one of the three following qualifications, sometimes with all of them. Either it was stated that the revenue had been diverted from its purposes by Parliament, or that those duties had fallen short of the sum for which they were given by Parliament, and that the intention of the legislator had not been fulfilled, or that the money required to discharge the civil list debt was to be raised chargeable on the civil list duties. In the reign of Queen Anne, the Crown was found in debt. The lessening and granting away some part of her revenue by Parliament was alleged as the cause of that debt, and pleaded as an equitable ground, such it certainly was, for discharging it. It does not appear that the duties which were then applied to the ordinary government produced clear above £580,000 a year, because when they were afterwards granted to George I, £120,000 was added to complete the whole to £700,000 a year. Indeed, it was then asserted, and I have no doubt truly, that for many years the net produce did not amount to above £550,000. The Queen's extraordinary charges were besides very considerable, equal at least to any we have known in our time. The application to Parliament was not for an absolute grant of money, but to empower the Queen to raise it by borrowing upon the civil list funds. The civil list debt was twice paid in the reign of George I. The money was granted upon the same plan which had been followed in the reign of Queen Anne. The civil list revenues were then mortgaged for the sum to be raised, and stood charged with the ransom of their own deliverance. George II received an addition to his civil list. Duties were granted for the purpose of raising £800,000 a year. It was not until he had reigned 19 years, and after the last rebellion, that he called upon Parliament for a discharge of the civil list debt. The extraordinary charges brought on by the rebellion account fully for the necessities of the Crown. However, the extraordinary charges of government were not thought a ground fit to be relied on. A deficiency of the civil list duties for several years before was stated as the principal, if not the sole ground, on which an application to Parliament could be justified. About this time the produce of these duties had fallen pretty low, and even upon an average of the whole reign they never produced £800,000 a year clear to the Treasury. That prince reigned 14 years afterwards. Not only no new demands were made, but with so much good order were his revenues and expenses regulated, that although many parts of the establishment of the court were upon a larger and more liberal scale than they have been since, there was a considerable sum in hand, on his decease, amounting to about £170,000, applicable to the service of the civil list of his present Majesty. So that, if this reign commenced with a greater charge than usual, there was enough, and more than enough, abundantly to supply all the extraordinary expense. That the civil list should have been exceeded in the two former reigns, especially in the reign of George I, was not at all surprising. His revenue was but £700,000 annually, if it ever produced so much clear. The prodigious and dangerous disaffection to the very being of the establishment, and the cause of a pretender, then powerfully abetted from abroad, produced many demands of an extraordinary nature, both abroad and at home. Much management and great expenses were necessary, but the throne of no prince has stood upon more unshaken foundations than that of his present Majesty. To have exceeded the sum given for the civil list, and to have incurred a debt without special authority of Parliament, was prima facie a criminal act, as such ministers ought naturally rather to have withdrawn it from the inspection than to have exposed it to the scrutiny of Parliament. Certainly they ought of themselves, officially, to have come armed with every sort of argument, which by explaining could excuse a matter in itself of presumptive guilt. But the terrors of the House of Commons are no longer for ministers. On the other hand, the peculiar character of the House of Commons, as trustee of the public purse, would have led them to call with a punctilious solicitude for every public account, and to have examined into them with the most rigorous accuracy. The capital use of an account is, that the reality of the charge, the reason of incurring it, and the justice and necessity of discharging it, should all appear antecedent to the payment. No man ever pays first and calls for his account afterwards, because he would thereby let out of his hands the principal, and indeed only effectual means, of compelling a full and fair one. But in national business, there is an additional reason for a previous production of every account. It is a check, perhaps the only one, upon a corrupt and prodigal use of public money. An account after payment is to no rational purpose an account. However, the House of Commons thought all these to be antiquated principles. They were of opinion that the most parliamentary way of proceeding was to pay first what the court thought proper to demand, and to take its chance for an examination into accounts at some time of greater leisure. The nation had settled £800,000 a year on the Crown, as sufficient for the support of its dignity, upon the estimate of its own ministers. When ministers came to Parliament and said that this allowance had not been sufficient for the purpose, and that they had incurred a debt of £500,000, would it not have been natural for Parliament first to ask how and by what means their appropriated allowance came to be insufficient? Would it not have savoured of some attention to justice, to have seen in what periods of administration this debt had been originally incurred, that they might discover, and if need were, animadvert on the persons who were found the most culpable, to put their hands upon such articles of expenditure as they thought improper or excessive, and to secure in future against such misapplication or exceeding. Accounts for any other purposes are but a matter of curiosity, and no genuine parliamentary object. All the accounts which could answer any parliamentary end were refused, or postponed by previous questions. Every idea of prevention was rejected, as conveying an improper suspicion of the ministers of the Crown. When every loading account had been refused, many others were granted with sufficient facility. But with great candour also, the House was informed that hardly any of them could be ready until the next session. Some of them perhaps not so soon, but in order firmly to establish the precedent of payment previous to account, and to form it into a settled rule of the House, the God in the machine was brought down, nothing less than the wonder-working law of Parliament. It was alleged that it is the law of Parliament, when any demand comes from the Crown, that the House must go immediately into the Committee of Supply, in which committee it was allowed that the production and examination of accounts would be quite proper and regular. It was therefore carried that they should go into the committee without delay, and without accounts, in order to examine with greater order and regularity things that could not possibly come before them. After this stroke of orderly and parliamentary wit and humour, they went into the committee, and very generously voted the payment. There was a circumstance in that debate too remarkable to be overlooked. This debt of the civil list was all along argued upon the same footing as a debt of the state, contracted upon national authority. Its payment was urged as equally pressing upon the public faith and honour, and when the whole year's account was stated, in what is called the budget, the ministry valued themselves on the payment of so much public debt, just as if they had discharged £500,000 of navy or exchequer bills, though in truth their payment from the sinking fund, of debt which was never contracted by parliamentary authority, was to all intents and purposes so much debt incurred. But such is the present notion of public credit and payment of debt, no wonder that it produces such effects. Nor was the House at all more attentive to a provident security against future than it had been to a vindictive retrospect to past mismanagements. I should have thought, indeed, that a ministerial promise, during their own continuance in office, might have been given, though this would have been but a poor security for the public. Mr. Pelham gave such an assurance, and he kept his word, but nothing was capable of extorting from our ministers anything which had the least resemblance to a promise of confining the expenses of the civil list within the limits which had been settled by Parliament. This reserve of theirs I look upon to be equivalent to the clearest declaration that they were resolved upon a contrary course. However, to put the matter beyond all doubt, in the speech from the throne, after thanking Parliament for the relief so liberally granted, the ministers informed the two houses that they will endeavour to confine the expenses of the civil government. Within what limits, think you? Those which the law had prescribed? Not in the least. Such limits as the honour of the Crown can possibly admit. Thus they established an arbitrary standard for that dignity which Parliament had defined and limited to a legal standard. They gave themselves, under the lax and indeterminate idea of the honour of the Crown, a full loose for all manner of dissipation and all manner of corruption. This arbitrary standard they were not afraid to hold out to both houses, while an idle and inoperative Act of Parliament, estimating the dignity of the Crown at £800,000 and confining it to that sum, adds to the number of obsolete statutes which load the shelves of libraries without any sort of advantage to the people. After this proceeding, I suppose that no man can be so weak as to think that the Crown is limited to any settled allowance whatsoever. For if the Ministry has £800,000 a year by the law of the land, and if by the law of Parliament all the debts which exceed it are to be paid previously to the production of any account, I presume that this is equivalent to an income with no other limits than the abilities of the subject and the moderation of the court. That is to say, it is such an income as is possessed by every absolute monarch in Europe. It amounts, as a person of great ability said in the debate, to an unlimited power of drawing upon the sinking fund. Its effect on the public credit of this kingdom must be obvious, for in vain is the sinking fund the great buttress of all the rest. If it be the power of the ministry to resort to it for the payment of any debts which they may choose to incur under the name of the civil list, and through the medium of a committee which thinks itself obliged by law to vote supplies without any other account than that of the mere existence of the debt, £500,000 is a serious sum, but it is nothing to the prolific principle upon which the sum was voted, a principle that may be well called the fruitful mother of 100 more. Neither is the damage to public credit of very great consequence, when compared with that which results to public morals and to the safety of the constitution from the exhaustless mine of corruption opened by the precedent, and to be wrought by the principle, of the late payment of the debts of the civil list. The power of discretionary disqualification by one law of Parliament, and the necessity of paying every debt of the civil list by another law of Parliament, if suffered to pass unnoticed, must establish such a fund of rewards and terrors as will make Parliament the best appendage and support of arbitrary power that ever was invented by the wit of man. This is felt. The quarrel is begun between the representatives and the people. The court faction have at length committed them. In such a strait, the wisest may well be perplexed, and the boldest staggered. The circumstances are in a great measure new. We have hardly any landmarks from the wisdom of our ancestors to guide us. At best we can only follow the spirit of their proceeding in other cases. I know the diligence with which my observations on our public disorders have been made. I am very sure of the integrity of the motives on which they are published. I cannot be equally confident in any plan for the absolute cure of these disorders, or for their certain future prevention. My aim is to bring this matter into more public discussion. Let the sagacity of others work upon it. It is not uncommon for medical writers to describe histories of diseases very accurately, on whose cure they can say but very little. The first ideas which generally suggest themselves for the cure of parliamentary disorders are to shorten the duration of parliaments, and to disqualify all, or a great number of placemen from a seat in the House of Commons. Whatever efficacy there may be in those remedies, I am sure in the present state of things it is impossible to apply them. A restoration of the right of free election is a preliminary indispensable to every other reformation. What alterations ought afterwards to be made in the Constitution is a matter of deep and difficult research. If I wrote merely to please the popular palate, it would indeed be as little troublesome to me as to another, to extol these remedies, so famous in speculation, but to which their greatest admirers have never attempted seriously to resort in practice. I confess, then, that I have no sort of reliance upon either a triennial Parliament or a place bill. With regard to the former, perhaps it might rather serve to counteract than to promote the ends that are proposed by it, to say nothing of the horrible disorders among the people attending frequent elections. I should be fearful of committing every 3 years the independent gentlemen of the country into a contest with the Treasury. It is easy to see which of the contending parties would be ruined first. Whoever has taken a careful view of public proceedings, so as to endeavour to ground his speculations on his experience, must have observed how prodigiously greater the power of ministry is in the first and last session of a Parliament than it is in the intermediate period, when members sit a little firm on their seats. The persons of the greatest parliamentary experience with whom I have conversed did constantly, in canvassing the fate of questions, allow something to the court side, upon account of the elections depending or imminent. The evil complained of, if it exists in the present state of beings, would hardly be removed by a triennial Parliament, for unless the influence of government in elections can be entirely taken away, the more frequently they return, the more they will harass private independence, the more generally men will be compelled to fly to the settled systematic interest of government and to the resources of a boundless civil list. Certainly something may be done, and ought to be done, towards lessening that influence in elections, and this will be necessary upon a plan either of longer or shorter duration of Parliament. But nothing can so perfectly remove the evil as not to render such contentions, too frequently repeated, utterly ruinous, first to independence of fortune, and then to independence of spirit. As I am only giving an opinion on this point, and not at all debating it in an adverse line, I hope I may be excused in another observation. With great truth I may aver that I never remember to have talked on this subject with any man much conversant with public business, who considered short parliaments as a real improvement of the constitution. Gentlemen warm in a popular cause are ready enough to attribute all the declarations of such persons to corrupt motives. But the habit of affairs, if on one hand it tends to corrupt the mind, furnishes it on the other with the means of better information. The authority of such persons will always have some weight. It may stand upon a par with the speculations of those who are less practised in business, and who, with perhaps purer intentions, have not so effectual means of judging. It is besides an effect of vulgar and puerile malignity to imagine that every statesman is of course corrupt, and that his opinion upon every constitutional point is solely formed upon some sinister interest. The next favourite remedy is a place bill. The same principle guides in both. I mean the opinion which is entertained by many of the infallibility of laws and regulations in the cure of public distempers. Without being as unreasonably doubtful as many are wisely confident, I will only say that this also is a matter very well worthy of serious and mature reflection. It is not easy to foresee what the effect would be of disconnecting with Parliament the greatest part of those who had civil employments, and of such mighty and important bodies as the military and naval establishments. It were better, perhaps, that they should have a corrupt interest in the forms of the Constitution, than that they should have none at all. This is a question altogether different from the disqualification of a particular description of revenue officers from seats in Parliament, or perhaps of all the lower sorts of them from votes in elections. In the former case only the few are affected, in the latter only the inconsiderable. But a great official, a great professional, a great military and naval interest, all necessarily comprehending many people of the first weight, ability, wealth, and spirit, has been gradually formed in the kingdom. These new interests must be let into a share of representation, else possibly they may be inclined to destroy those institutions of which they are not permitted to partake. This is not a thing to be trifled with, nor is it every well-meaning man that is fit to put his hands to it. Many other serious considerations occur. I do not open them here, because they are not directly to my purpose, proposing only to give the reader some taste of the difficulties that attend all capital changes in the Constitution, just to hint the uncertainty, to say no worse, of being able to prevent the court, as long as it has the means of influence abundantly in its power, of applying that influence to Parliament, and perhaps, if the public method were precluded, of doing it in some worse and more dangerous method. Underhand and oblique ways would be studied. The science of evasion, already tolerably understood, would then be brought to the greatest perfection. It is of no inconsiderable part of wisdom to know how much of an evil ought to be tolerated, lest by attempting a degree of purity impracticable in degenerate times and manners, instead of cutting off the subsisting ill practices, new corruptions might be produced for the concealment and security of the old. It were better, undoubtedly, that no influence at all could affect the mind of a member of Parliament. But of all modes of influence, in my opinion, a place under the government is the least disgraceful to the man who holds it, and by far the most safe to the country. I would not shut out that sort of influence which is open and visible, which is connected with the dignity and the service of the state, when it is not in my power to prevent the influence of contracts, of subscriptions, of direct bribery, and those innumerable methods of clandestine corruption, which are abundantly in the hands of the court, and which will be applied as long as these means of corruption and the disposition to be corrupted have existence among us. Our constitution stands on a nice equipoise, with steep precipices and deep waters upon all sides of it. In removing it from a dangerous leaning towards one side, there may be a risk of oversetting it on the other. Every project of a material change in a government so complicated as ours, combined at the same time with external circumstances still more complicated, is a matter full of difficulties, in which a considerate man will not be too ready to decide, a prudent man too ready to undertake, or an honest man too ready to promise. They do not respect the public nor themselves, who engage for more than they are sure that they ought to attempt, or that they are able to perform. These are my sentiments, weak perhaps, but honest and unbiassed, and submitted entirely to the opinion of grave men, well affected to the constitution of their country, and of experience in what may best promote or hurt it. Indeed, in the situation in which we stand, with an immense revenue, an enormous debt, mighty establishments, government itself a great banker and a great merchant, I see no other way for the preservation of a decent attention to public interest in the representatives, but the interposition of the body of the people itself, whenever it shall appear, by some flagrant and notorious act, by some capital innovation, that these representatives are going to overleap the fences of the law, and to introduce an arbitrary power. This interposition is a most unpleasant remedy, but if it be a legal remedy, it is intended on some occasion to be used then only when it is evident that nothing else can hold the constitution to its true principles. The distempers of monarchy were the great subjects of apprehension and redress in the last century. In this, the distempers of Parliament. It is not in Parliament alone that the remedy for parliamentary disorders can be completed. Hardly indeed can it begin there. Until a confidence in government is re-established, the people ought to be excited to a more strict and detailed attention to the conduct of their representatives. Standards for judging more systematically upon their conduct ought to be settled in the meetings of counties and corporations. Frequent and correct lists of the voters in all important questions ought to be procured. By such means something may be done. By such means it may appear who those are that by an indiscriminate support of all administrations have totally banished all integrity and confidence out of public proceedings, have confounded the best men with the worst, and weakened and dissolved instead of strengthening and compacting the general frame of government. If any person is more concerned for government and order than for the liberties of his country, even he is equally concerned to put an end to this course of indiscriminate support. It is this blind and undistinguishing support that feeds the spring of those very disorders, by which he is frightened into the arms of the faction which contains in itself the source of all disorders, by enfeebling all the visible and regular authority of the state. The distemper is increased by his injudicious and preposterous endeavours or pretences for the cure of it. End of section 32. Section 33 of the Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. The Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1, by Edmund Burke. Of Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontent, Part 6. An exterior administration chosen for its impotency, or after it is chosen purposely rendered impotent, in order to be rendered subservient, will not be obeyed. The laws themselves will not be respected, when those who execute them are despised, and they will be despised when their power is not immediate from the crown, or natural in the kingdom. Never were ministers better supported in Parliament. Parliamentary support comes and goes with office, totally regardless of the man or the merit. Is government strengthened? It grows weaker and weaker. The popular torrent gains upon it every hour. Let us learn from our experience. It is not support that is wanting to government, but reformation. When ministry rests upon public opinion, it is not indeed built upon a rock of adamant. It is, however, some stability. But when it stands upon private humour, its structure is of stubble, and its foundation is on quicksand. I repeat it again, he that supports every administration subverts all government. The reason is this: the whole business in which a court usually takes an interest goes on at present equally well, in whatever hands, whether high or low, wise or foolish, scandalous or reputable. There is nothing therefore to hold it firm to any one body of men, or to any one consistent scheme of politics. Nothing interposes to prevent the full operation of all the caprices and all the passions of a court upon the servants of the public. The system of administration is open to continual shocks and changes, upon the principles of the meanest cabal and the most contemptible intrigue. Nothing can be solid and permanent. All good men at length fly with horror from such a service. Men of rank and ability with the spirit which ought to animate such men in a free state, while they decline the jurisdiction of dark cabal on their actions and their fortunes, will, for both, cheerfully put themselves upon their country. They will trust an inquisitive and distinguishing Parliament, because it does inquire and does distinguish. If they act well, they know that in such a Parliament they will be supported against any intrigue. If they act ill, they know that no intrigue can protect them. This situation, however awful, is honourable. But in 1 hour, and in the self-same assembly, without any assigned or assignable cause, to be precipitated from the highest authority to the most marked neglect, possibly into the greatest peril of life and reputation, is a situation full of danger and destitute of honour. It will be shunned equally by every man of prudence and every man of spirit. Such are the consequences of the division of court from the administration, and of the division of public men among themselves. By the former of these lawful government is undone. By the latter all opposition to lawless power is rendered impotent. Government may in a great measure be restored, if any considerable bodies of men have honesty and resolution enough never to accept administration, unless this garrison of king's men, which is stationed as in a citadel, to control and enslave it, be entirely broken and disbanded, and every work they have thrown up be levelled with the ground. The disposition of public men to keep this corps together, and to act under it, or to co-operate with it, is a touchstone by which every administration ought in future to be tried. There has not been one which has not sufficiently experienced the utter incompatibility of that faction with the public peace, and with all the ends of good government, since if they opposed it, they soon lost every power of serving the crown. If they submitted to it, they lost all the esteem of their country. Until ministers give to the public a full proof of their entire alienation from that system, however plausible their pretences, we may be sure they are more intent on the emoluments than the duties of office. If they refuse to give this proof, we know of what stuff they are made. In this particular, it ought to be the electors' business to look to their representatives. The electors ought to esteem it no less culpable in their member to give a single vote in Parliament to such an administration than to take an office under it, to endure it than to act in it. The notorious infidelity and versatility of members of Parliament in their opinions of men and things ought in a particular manner to be considered by the electors in the inquiry which is recommended to them. This is one of the principal holdings of that destructive system which has endeavoured to unhinge all the virtuous, honourable, and useful connections in the kingdom. This cabal has, with great success, propagated a doctrine which serves for a colour to those acts of treachery, and whilst it receives any degree of countenance, it will be utterly senseless to look for a vigorous opposition to the court party. The doctrine is this, that all political connections are in their nature factious, and as such ought to be dissipated and destroyed, and that the rule for forming administrations is more personal ability, rated by the judgment of this cabal upon it, and taken by drafts from every division and denomination of public men. This decree was solemnly promulgated by the head of the court corps, the Earl of Bute himself, in a speech which he made in the year 1766, against the then administration, the only administration which he has ever been known directly and publicly to oppose. It is indeed in no way wonderful that such persons should make such declarations. That connection and faction are equivalent terms is an opinion which has been carefully inculcated at all times by unconstitutional statesmen. The reason is evident. Whilst men are linked together, They easily and speedily communicate the alarm of any evil design. They are enabled to fathom it with common counsel, and to oppose it with united strength. Whereas when they lie dispersed without concert, order, or discipline, communication is uncertain, counsel difficult, and resistance impracticable. Where men are not acquainted with each other's principles, nor experienced in each other's talents, nor at all practised in their mutual habitudes and dispositions by joint efforts in business, no personal confidence, no friendship, no common interest subsisting among them, it is evidently impossible that they can act a public part with uniformity, perseverance, or efficacy. In a connection, the most inconsiderable man, by adding to the weight of the whole, has his value and his use. Out of it, the greatest talents are wholly unserviceable to the public. No man who is not inflamed by vainglory into enthusiasm can flatter himself that his single, unsupported, desultory, unsystematic endeavours are of power to defeat the subtle designs and united cabals of ambitious citizens. When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. It is not enough in a situation of trust in the Commonwealth that a man means well to his country. It is not enough that in his single person he never did an evil act, but always voted according to his conscience, and even harangued against every design which he apprehended to be prejudicial to the interests of his country. This innoxious and ineffectual character, that seems formed upon a plan of apology and disculpation, falls miserably short of the mark of public duty. That duty demands and requires that what is right should not only be made known, but made prevalent, that what is evil should not only be detected, but defeated. When the public man omits to put himself in a situation of doing his duty with effect, it is an omission that frustrates the purpose of his trust almost as much as if he had formerly betrayed it. It is surely no very rational account of a man's life that he has always acted right, but has taken special care to act in such a manner that his endeavours could not possibly be productive of any consequence. I do not wonder that the behaviour of many parties should have made persons of tender and scrupulous virtue somewhat out of humour with all sorts of connection in politics. I admit that people frequently acquire in such confederacies a narrow, bigoted, and prescriptive spirit, that they are apt to sink the idea of the general good in this circumscribed and partial interest. But where duty renders a critical situation a necessary one, it is our business to keep free from the evils attendant upon it, and not to fly from the situation itself. If a fortress is seated in an unwholesome air, an officer of the garrison is obliged to be attentive to his health, but he must not desert his station. Every profession, not excepting the glorious one of a soldier, or the sacred one of a priest, is liable to its own particular vices, which, however, form no argument against those ways of life, nor are the vices themselves inevitable to every individual in those professions. Of such a nature are connections in politics, essentially necessary for the full performance of our public duty, accidentally liable to degenerate into faction. Commonwealths are made of families, free commonwealths of parties also, and we may as well affirm that our natural regards and ties of blood tend inevitably to make men bad citizens, as that the bonds of our party weaken those by which we are held to our country. Some legislators went so far as to make neutrality in party a crime against the state. I do not know whether this might not have been rather to overstrain the principle. Certain it is, the best patriots in the greatest commonwealths have always commended and promoted such connections. idem sentiri de Republica, was with them a principal ground of friendship and attachment. Nor do I know any other capable of forming firmer, dearer, more pleasing, more honourable, and more virtuous habitudes. The Romans carried this principle a great way. Even the holding of offices together, the disposition of which arose from chance, not selection, gave rise to a relation which continued for life. It was called necessitudo sortis, and it was looked upon with a sacred reverence. Breaches of any of these kinds of civil relation were considered as acts of the most distinguished turpitude. The whole people was distributed into political societies, in which they acted in support of such interests in the state as they severally affected. For it was then thought no crime to endeavour by every honest means to advance to superiority and power those of your own sentiments and opinions. This wise people was far from imagining that those connections had no tie, and obliged to no duty, but that men might quit them without shame, upon every call of interest. They believed private honour to be the great foundation of public trust, that friendship was no mean step towards patriotism, that he who, in the common intercourse of life, showed he regarded somebody besides himself, when he came to act in a public situation, might probably consult some other interest than his own. Never may we become plus sagus caela sagus, as the French comedian has happily expressed it, wiser than all the wise and good men who have lived before us. It was their wish to see public and private virtues not dissonant and jarring, and mutually destructive, but harmoniously combined, growing out of one another in a noble and orderly gradation, reciprocally supporting and supported. In one of the most fortunate periods of our history, this country was governed by a connection. I mean the great connection of Whigs in the reign of Queen Anne. They were complimented upon the principle of this connection by a poet who was in high esteem with them. Addison, who knew their sentiments, could not praise them for what they considered as no proper subject of commendation. As a poet who knew his business, he could not applaud them for a thing which in general estimation was not highly reputable. Addressing himself to Britain, thy favourites grow not up by fortune's sport, or from the crimes or follies of a court. On the firm basis of desert they rise, from long-tried faith and friendship's holy ties. The Whigs of those days believed that the only proper method of rising into power was through hard essays of practised friendship and experimented fidelity. At the time it was not imagined that patriotism was a bloody idol, which required the sacrifice of children and parents, or dearest connections in private life, and of all the virtues that rise from those relations. They were not of that ingenious paradoxical morality to imagine that a spirit of moderation was properly shown in patiently bearing the sufferings of your friends, or that disinterestedness was clearly manifested at the expense of other people's fortune. They believed that no men could act with effect who did not act in concert, that no men could act in concert who did not act with confidence, that no men could act with confidence who were not bound together by common opinions, common affections, and common interests. These wise men, for such I must call Lord Sunderland, Lord Godolphin, Lord Somers, and Lord Marlborough, were too well principled in these maxims, upon which the whole fabric of public strength is built, to be blown off their ground by the breath of every childish talker. They were not afraid that they should be called an ambitious junto, or that their resolution to stand or fall together should by placemen be interpreted into a scuffle for places. Party is a body of men united for promoting by their joint endeavours the national interest upon some particular principle, in which they are all agreed. For my part, I find it impossible to conceive that anyone believes in his own politics, or thinks them to be of any weight, who refuses to adopt the means of having them reduced into practice. It is the business of the speculative philosopher to mark the proper ends of government. It is the business of the politician, who is the philosopher in action, to find out proper means towards those ends, and to employ them with effect. Therefore every honourable connection will avow it is their first purpose to pursue every just method to put the men who hold their opinions into such a condition as may enable them to carry their common plans into execution, with all the power and authority of the state. As this power is attached to certain situations, it is their duty to contend for these situations. Without a prescription of others, they are bound to give to their own party the preference in all things, and by no means, for private considerations, to accept any offers of power in which the whole body is not included, nor to suffer themselves to be led or to be controlled, or to be overbalanced in office or in council, by those who contradict the very fundamental principles on which their party is formed, and even those upon which every fair connection must stand. Such a generous contention for power, on such manly and honourable maxims, will easily be distinguished from the mean and interested struggle for place and emolument. The very style of such persons will serve to discriminate them from those numberless impostors who have deluded the ignorant with professions incompatible with human practice, and have afterwards incensed them by practices below the level of vulgar rectitude. It is an advantage to all narrow wisdom and narrow morals that their maxims have a plausible air, and on a cursory view appear equal to first principles. They are light and portable. They are as current as copper coin, and about as valuable. They serve equally the first capacities and the lowest, and they are at least as useful to the worst men as to the best. Of this stamp is the cant of not men but measures, a sort of charm by which many people get loose from every honourable engagement. When I see a man acting this desultory and disconnected part, with as much detriment to his own fortune as prejudice to the cause of any party, I am not persuaded that he is right, but I am ready to believe he is in earnest. I respect virtue in all its situations, even when it is found in the unsuitable company of weakness. I lament to see qualities rare and valuable squandered away without any public utility. But when a gentleman with great visible emoluments abandons the party in which he has long acted, and tells you it is because he proceeds upon his own judgment, that he acts on the merits of the several measures as they arise, and that he is obliged to follow his own conscience, and not that of others, he gives reasons which it is impossible to controvert, and discovers a character which it is impossible to mistake. What shall we think of him who never differed from a certain set of men until the moment they lost their power, and who never agreed with them in a single instance afterwards? Would not such a coincidence of interest and opinion be rather fortunate? Would it not be an extraordinary cast upon the dice, that a man's connections should degenerate into faction, precisely at the critical moment when they lose their power or he accepts a place? When people desert their connections, the desertion is a manifest fact, upon which a direct simple issue lies, triable by plain men. Whether a measure of government be right or wrong is no matter of fact, but a mere affair of opinion, on which men may, as they do, dispute and wrangle without end. But whether the individual thinks the measure right or wrong is a point at still a greater distance from the reach of all human decision. It is therefore very convenient to politicians not to put the judgment of their conduct on overt acts, cognizable in any ordinary court, but upon such matter as can be triable only in that secret tribunal, where they are sure of being heard with favour, or where at worst the sentence will be only private whipping. I believe the reader would wish to find no substance in a doctrine which has a tendency to destroy all test of character as deduced from conduct. He will therefore excuse my adding something more towards the further clearing up a point which the great convenience of obscurity to dishonesty has been able to cover with some degree of darkness and doubt, in order to throw an odium on political connection. Those politicians suppose it a necessary incident to it, that you are blindly to follow the opinions of your party, when in direct opposition to your own clear ideas, a degree of servitude that no worthy man could bear the thought of submitting to, and such as, I believe, no connections, except some court factions, ever could be so senselessly tyrannical as to impose. Men thinking freely will, in particular instances, think differently, but still as the greater part of the measures which arise in the course of public business are related to or dependent on some great leading general principles in government, a man must be peculiarly unfortunate in the choice of his political company, if he does not agree with them at least 9 times in 10. If he does not concur in these general principles upon which the party is founded, and which necessarily draw on a concurrence in their application, he ought from the beginning to have chosen some other more conformable to his opinions. When the question is in its nature doubtful, or not very material, the modesty which becomes an individual, and in spite of our court moralists, that partiality which becomes a well-chosen friendship, will frequently bring on an acquiescence in the general sentiment. Thus the disagreement will naturally be rare. It will be only enough to indulge freedom without violating concord or disturbing arrangement. And this is all that ever was required for a character of the greatest uniformity and steadiness in connection. How men can proceed without any connection at all is to me utterly incomprehensible. Of what sort of materials must that man be made? How must he be tempered and put together? Who can sit whole years in Parliament, with 550 of his fellow citizens, amidst the storm of such tempestuous passions, in the sharp conflict of so many wits and tempers and characters, in the agitation of such mighty questions, in the discussion of such vast and ponderous interests, without seeing any one sort of men, whose character, conduct, or disposition would lead him to associate himself with them, to aid and be aided in any one system of public utility? I remember an old scholastic aphorism, which says that the man who lives wholly detached from others must be either an angel or a devil. When I see in any of these detached gentlemen of our times the angelic purity, power, and beneficence, I shall admit them to be angels. In the meantime we are born only to be men. We shall do enough if we form ourselves to be good ones. It is therefore our business carefully to cultivate in our minds, to rear to the most perfect vigour and maturity, every sort of generous and honest feeling that belongs to our nature, to bring the dispositions that are lovely in private life into the service and conduct of the Commonwealth, so to be patriots as not to forget we are gentlemen, to cultivate friendships and to incur enmities, to have both strong but both selected, in the one to be placeable, in the other immovable, to model our principles to our duties and our situation, to be fully persuaded that all virtue which is impracticable is spurious, and rather to run the risk of falling into faults in a course which leads us to act with effect and energy than to loiter out our days without blame and without use. Public life is a situation of power and energy. He trespasses against his duty who sleeps upon his watch, as well as he that goes over to the enemy. There is, however, a time for all things. It is not every conjuncture which calls with equal force upon the activity of honest men, but critical exigencies now and then arise, and I am mistaken if this be not one of them. Men will see the necessity of honest combination, but they may see it when it is too late. They may embody when it will be ruinous to themselves and of no advantage to the country. When, for want of such a timely union as may enable them to oppose in favour of the laws, with the laws on their side, they may at length find themselves under the necessity of conspiring instead of consulting. The law for which they stand may become a weapon in the hands of its bitterest enemies, and they will be cast at length into that miserable alternative between slavery and civil confusion, which no good man can look upon without horror, an alternative in which 'tis impossible he should take either part with a conscience perfectly at repose. To keep that situation of guilt and remorse at the utmost distance is, therefore, our first obligation. Early activity may prevent late and fruitless violence. As yet we work in the light. The scheme of the enemies of public tranquillity have disarranged. It has not destroyed us. If the reader believes that there really exists such a faction as I have described, a faction ruling by the private inclinations of a court, against the general sense of the people, and that this faction, whilst it pursues a scheme for undermining all the foundations of our freedom, weakens, for the present at least, all the powers of executory government, rendering us abroad contemptible, and at home distracted, he will believe also that nothing but a firm combination of public men against this body, and that too supported by the hearty concurrence of the people at large, can possibly get the better of it. The people will see the necessity of restoring public men to an attention to the public opinion, and of restoring the Constitution to its original principles. Above all, they will endeavour to keep the House of Commons from assuming a character which does not belong to it. They will endeavour to keep that House, for its existence, for its powers and its privileges, as independent of every other, and as dependent upon themselves as possible. This servitude is to a House of Commons like obedience to the divine law, perfect freedom. For if they once quit this natural, rational, and liberal obedience, having deserted the only proper foundation of their power, they must seek a support in an abject and unnatural dependence somewhere else. When, through the medium of this just connection with their constituents, the genuine dignity of the House of Commons is restored, it will begin to think of casting from it with scorn, as badges of servility, all the false ornaments of illegal power, with which it has been for some time disgraced. It will begin to think of its old office of control. It will not suffer that last of evils to predominate in the country. Men without popular confidence, public opinion, natural connection, or mutual trust, invested with all the powers of government. When they have learned this lesson themselves, they will be willing and able to teach the court that it is the true interest of the prince to have but one administration, and that one composed of those who recommend themselves to their sovereign through the opinion of their country, and not by their obsequiousness to a favourite. Such men will serve their sovereign with affection and fidelity, because his choice of them upon such principles is a compliment to their virtue. They will be able to serve him effectually, because they will add the weight of the country to the force of the executory power. They will be able to serve their king with dignity, because they will never abuse his name to the gratification of their private spleen or avarice. This, with allowances for human frailty, may probably be the general character of a ministry, which thinks itself accountable to the House of Commons, when the House of Commons thinks itself accountable to its constituents. If other ideas should prevail, things must remain in their present confusion, until they are hurried into all the rage of civil violence, or until they sink into the dead repose of despotism. End of section 33. End of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 1, by Edmund Burke.